Joe Rogan Podcast. Check it out.
The Joe Rogan Experience.
Train by day, Joe Rogan Podcast by night, all day.
Free speech and why you should give a damn, Jonathan Zimmerman. Why should we give a damn?
Well, we should give a damn because free speech has been at the heart of every movement for change in this country. Every great warrior against oppression was also a warrior for free speech.
But wouldn't it be convenient if we just silence people we disagree with? That seems a lot easier for me.
No, it's natural. All right?
It is natural, right?
And that's why we have to resist it.
Yes.
Like, I get it. Like,
Yeah.
everyone's experienced that. Everyone's
Yes.
seen somebody or heard somebody they despise and say, God, I just want that person to shut up.
Right.
And that's why we have to resist it.
There's a lot of very intelligent people that disagree with you in this current political climate, unfortunately. I think that was exacerbated by the Trump administration and this desire to stop a lot of the QAnon stuff and the Pizzagate stuff and a lot of these conspiracy theories that people were frustrated that they were taking hold, and they were like, how do we stop this? We got to stop these people from talking.
Right.
So that's the argument for censorship.
That's one of them. And the other argument has to do with race and ethnicity. I mean, the other
Yes.
argument is that it harms minorities. And I think those are different arguments, but sometimes they're connected.
You mean censorship against racism? Is that what you're
Correct.
saying? Okay,
Correct.
yeah.
Yeah.
Or sexism or homophobia or any of those things. Yeah. It's I think one of the problems that we're dealing with in today's climate is not just that everything's hyper politicized and people are really very passionate in debating things online, but just the nature of online discourse is so limited. It lends itself to simple sentences, 140 or 280 symbols. It's just not enough. It's not enough characters to express yourself. And then also text. Unless you're writing a book, it's hard to get all your thoughts out.
And also one of the things that people that study communications have taught us is that when we have exchanges online, they tend to be more uncivil. We will type things and text things about somebody or to somebody that we would never, ever say to their face.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't do that. I try really hard to not do that. And I stopped even going back and forth with people on Twitter a few years ago.
Yeah.
And now I take about a year and a half or so ago, I took it even further. I don't even read my mentions. I don't go in there. I open Twitter up once a day to see if something crazy is happening. Is any place on fire? Is anybody doing something they shouldn't be doing? What is happening? And
I'm an op-ed columnist, and a couple of years ago I stopped reading the commentary about the op-eds. Because generally it's not that well informed. I mean, there are exceptions to that, but generally it's just people shooting from the hip, and often in a really nasty and derogatory way. It doesn't help.
What do you think about what is it about social media that lends itself to toxic exchanges? Because it seems to be, I know people that are pretty friendly, positive people in person. When I meet them, they're friendly. They hug me. And then I see them online. I'm like, you talk so much shit. Why are you doing this?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously the anonymity is part of it, right? I mean, it's,
But they're not even anonymous.
I know, but you can trick yourself into thinking that, right? It's you and your keyboard, right? And a bunch of symbols. There is something that's weirdly dehumanizing about it, right?
Yeah.
You can trick yourself into thinking that you're not dealing with other human beings. It's just a bunch of text.
Right. And that, this idea of don't say something to someone online that you wouldn't say to them to their face. A lot of people don't like that. No, because I don't want to be uncomfortable, but I want to express myself. So if I'm around you, if I said what I really felt, I would feel uncomfortable. I don't like it. But I don't like what you did, or I don't like what you said. So I'm going to be like, fuck you. And I want to say that online from the safety of my own living room.
Again, I get that, but it's more than a little cowardly, right?
It is a lot cowardly, yeah. But there's some benefit in being cowardly too, though. And this is that there are people that, for whatever reasons, maybe they're socially awkward, they don't have the courage to say things to someone's face, but maybe that person needs to hear them. So this is the other perspective, in favor of talking shit.
Yeah, well, look, again, I'm not against social media. That would be like being against oxygen now, right? Or air, right? It's part of our life stream, right?
Yeah.
I think the question is, how we can use it in ways that help us communicate and understand each other. That should be the question we're asking, right? How can we put it to positive rather than negative uses?
Well, free speech is not just being able to express yourself now. Now it's being able to express yourself through these private companies.
Yeah.
Which is very strange. So now the arbiter of free speech is YouTube and Facebook and Twitter, and it's like, wow, like those are the town squares of our world now.
Yeah, and when I discuss the free speech question with my students, I often say, look, anyone in this room is free to make a case for any kind of speech restriction they'd like, provided that they tell me who's going to do the restricting.
Yes.
All right? And often it comes down to Jack Dorsey.
Right. Well, it's not really Jack. It's really the other people that work with Jack.
Yes, right. His company.
In defense of Jack, though, he honestly wants Twitter to be wild. He wanted
absolutely.
He's even proposed a separate Twitter that is completely uncensored, or you can have the moderated Twitter.
No, I think that, in his public statements, I think he's been admirably ambivalent about this.
I like him a lot. I really do.
Right. And I think before Trump got cut off, which I didn't agree with, I think Dorsey generally had the right idea, which is when we see something posted on Twitter that we think is, wrong or horrible, instead of muzzling it, what we're going to do is we're going to add our 2 cents, right? And we're going to put a flag on it saying, by the way, we think this is bullshit, and here's why. And look, that's a form of free speech as well, right? Mm-hmm. Using your free speech to criticize speech that you think is abhorrent is an act of free speech.
Yes.
And I think that seemed to me to be Dorsey's impulse. Rather than muzzling people, adding a voice that tries to inform people about what they've seen.
Do you think that it's also a function of there's a limited amount of time when you're running an election, right? So like if you only have a few months when an election's rolling around and there's this person who is like getting all these people riled up and saying a bunch of crazy shit that may not be true, and they have a choice to make. Like you can let it play out its natural course. Like the logical and informed response to bad speech is always better speech. Mm-hmm. Like how do you deal with bad speech? You combat it with debate and more articulate, more well thought out, more sensible speech. That's supposed to be so that if a person is on the sidelines and objectively looking at the two arguments, they look at that one and go, well, that makes more sense. Mm-hmm. This guy's trying to rile people up, but he's incorrect, and this is why. But you only have 3 months.
Correct.
And there's a natural time that these things take to play out before you figure out what's bullshit and what's not.
Right. And also the other thing I'd add, Joe, is although I agree with the dynamic you just described, in order to pull that off, you need a certain sort of education.
Yes.
Right? And that's why I think, one of the things I study is education, and I think that's absolutely a critical part of this discussion, right? To reason and deliberate in the way you were just describing, that's not a natural act either. Yeah. We don't come out of the womb doing that, right? We need institutions to teach us how to do that, and they've not done a very good job of it.
Yeah, and teaching people how to think about things and how to look at things and analyze things in an objective manner. What's going on?
Sorry.
Is he leaning back? Is that the issue? Not enough volume. Teaching people how to think is not necessarily, like critical thinking skills, it's not really highlighted in school, especially in high school. It's not something that you really spend a lot of time.
Well, unfortunately, we give rhetorical obeisance to it, but we don't do it nearly enough. And when you interview kids about their high school experience and you ask them, did you really engage in dialogue about substantive questions where there was real debate? Generally, they say no.
Yeah, and the problem with debate is oftentimes you're just trying to win, right? So sometimes people are just very theatrical and very loud and dynamic, or they'll touch upon like certain things, like, and that certain things that they think, like whether or not it's valid to the conversation, they'll add those things to it because there's certain social clout to those
Definitely.
subjects.
Look, the hardest thing to do as a young person is to figure out what you really think,
Right.
Not what the people around you are saying, your peers or your parents or your teachers, what you really think. And the problem is we haven't actually created educational institutions that help people do that.
Right.
What they do is they encourage people to mouth things they've heard from others rather than to come up with like, okay, what do I actually think about this?
Right. 'Cause it also sounds good if you can mouth things that other people have said really well and you can kind of put it in your own words. It sounds smart.
And also, remember, if you're in high school, you're an adolescent. And adolescents, we know from developmental psychology, they're very attuned to other adolescents, right?
Yes.
That's what it's about.
Yeah.
It's who's cool, who's cute, who's going out with whom, and so I think there's almost a developmental reason that you would try to sort of tailor your opinions to the people around you. But that's not good for you, and it's definitely not good for our democracy. One way of thinking about all this social media stuff is we're all teenagers now. And we're all doing precisely that, trying to figure out who's cool and who isn't, right? And trying to get on the right side and, as you were saying, to mouth the right things.
Yeah. And be in with the cool kids.
Correct.
You want to be at the cool table in the cafeteria.
Whoever they are, right? And again, it's not good for you.
No, it's not.
Or our democracy, more to the point.
I was really lucky when I was young, and we were talking about this earlier when you asked about my accent, that I moved around a lot. Yeah. And I think that was really good. It sucked at the time because, I moved to San Francisco when I was 7, from New Jersey to San Francisco, and then Florida when I was 11, and then when I was 13, we moved to Boston. It was a lot of moving.
Yeah.
And because of that, I didn't develop this core group of friends that I grew up with. It was, it was a little chaotic, but it forced me to formulate my own opinions about things.
I had a very similar upbringing in different places. I actually grew up overseas because my parents were in the Peace Corps, as I was subsequently. And so as an elementary schooler, I lived in India and Iran. And then I lived in New York and in Washington. But like yourself, for me, except for meeting my wife, that was the formative experience of my life, I would say, living in all those different environments as a really little kid. Because also when you're little, you don't know how weird the shit you're doing is. It's just because you just do it. It's so like in Bangalore, India, my parents sent me to a girls' school, which took a couple boys in the younger grades because it was the Anglo school that was near where we lived. And it was actually a fabulous experience, to be, like one of a couple boys in a whole room full of girls. But nobody told me that was just bizarre.
Right.
I just did it.
You and that other boy must have been like, what are we doing here, man?
Yeah, no, but it's funny, Joe, I don't even remember doing that. It's just,
just
like when you're young, you just do what's there.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I lived in Iran in the late 60s when, Tehran was this hugely cosmopolitan place.
Completely different than it is now, right?
Totally different,
What is that like to have those memories and to see what it's like now where they just executed an Olympic wrestler for engaging in a political protest.
No, it's incredibly depressing. And in some ways, Iran was really an unlikely place for the Islamic Revolution. Iran is it's a pluralist place. It's a crossroads, and it has been for 10,000 years. And it's interesting you mention Iran because, when the Pew does these pro and anti-American surveys where they take a sample of people in different countries and say, what do you think of America? Except for Israel, the Iranians like us more than any country in the Middle East.
Yeah, I've heard that.
And you would never get that from the saber rattling that you see in the newspapers.
What do you think that is?
Well, I think it's because the history of the country is so pluralist. Iran, everyone conquered it. Right? It's a huge mishmash of ethnicities and historically of religions. It obviously had big Jewish populations, Baha'i populations. Obviously, most of those people have been exiled, right? But that's very recent history. And let's also remember it's a country of about 80 million people, and over half of them were born well after Khomeini. So all they know is this corrupt regime that's governed them, and they don't like it. There's a huge amount of dissent in Iran. It's just that I think, this is a whole other wrap, but I think the United States and the rest of the world haven't really figured out how to really harness that dissent. I think, people pick up the newspaper and they imagine Iran as this place of kind of like Islamicist ditto heads, and it is not that, not by any measure.
Wow. That's got to be so strange to have grown up there and see this gigantic shift and have these memories of what it was like previously.
Yeah.
When it was this sort of cosmopolitan center.
It was. People from all over the world. I went to an international school and I had friends from, Hong Kong and South Africa and England. But also we can't romanticize it. I mean, it was a dictatorship. And, in some ways I think my concerns about free speech in some ways stem from that experience as well, because I can remember my parents on the, when they would talk on the phone, they would often sort of say jokingly, hey, we better not go there. We don't know who's listening.
Yeah, well, that's everywhere now, though.
Right, for different reasons,
yeah,
right? But,
NSA. Hi, NSA. Well, this is a podcast, so they're definitely listening to this.
That's right.
But your phone.
That's right.
When Edward Snowden had to leave the country and Glenn Greenwald, they published that story about the NSA's, all the shit that he leaked where there was this widespread surveillance on the American public. That's really disturbing.
It is disturbing. And again, the difference is, thanks to democracy and free speech, you and I can critique that. We may not be able to control it. We may not be able to end it. It's a complicated question, but nobody's going to come in the night for my family or for yours because we're criticizing the NSA.
Yeah, we can critique it, but it still exists.
Yes, it does.
It's very strange.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, you can't do that. You shouldn't have done that. Oh, you're still doing it? Oh. Are they still doing it? They are still doing it. Okay. Well, what do we do about that? Well, they're not doing anything with it. Well, right now they're not doing anything with it. Jesus Christ, this is crazy.
Well, I forget which comedian made a joke out of this when it all started during Obama, some of the leaks about this. And, I forget who it was, but a comedian said, well, look, Americans said that they wanted a president that listens to everyone. Here you go.
That's funny. That's whoever you are. Yeah. It's, but that is, in a sense, it's encouraging self-censorship. And that's one of the things about privacy that makes privacy so critical, is because if you cannot express yourself without fear of other people listening, then there is a component of self-censorship, which is critical to the North Koreans, the regime's way of keeping people in line, is they have a form of self-censorship.
Correct.
They have everybody tattle on everybody.
Right. Right. And, look, we have forms of that in this country, too. And you've got to be really careful when you talk about it because it's not North Korea. Right.
Of course.
And but on college campuses, like the ones that I work at, there are forms of self-censorship. They're not enforced by, bad guys with sunglasses and baseball bats, right?
Right.
It's part of the culture, unfortunately. But, there's now a big survey literature about it that's very upsetting. So, both students and faculty, you ask them, are you saying what you think? And large numbers of them say no. And that includes Democrats and Republicans, men and women, students and faculty. And so it's not North Korea. It never has been, never will be. But those of us who care about free speech should be really upset about it nevertheless.
Well, there's certainly rigid ideologies on college campuses, but do they get specific about saying what they really mean or think? Like, what is it? What are the key subjects?
Well, look, I'll give you an example, and this came up in another book that I wrote. There was a survey done of full-time faculty about 10 years ago, and the question was, do you agree with the use of race and ethnicity in college admissions? And it turned out that 40% of the respondents said no. Now, for the sake of transparency, I should tell you that I'm in the 60%. I think affirmative action has been a net gain for the university. It's a complicated question, but I think it's been a net win. Nevertheless, I was upset by the 40% figure. Not that there were people that disagreed with me. I was upset that I hadn't heard from them. Right? They are biting their tongues.
Right.
And that can't be good. It can't be good for affirmative action. Right? Which could only benefit from people really. Affirmative action is a complicated question, right? And, it cuts to a lot of different, really, really complex questions. And if we're biting our tongues about it, we won't get to good answers. And so obviously the people that oppose affirmative action are afraid to do so publicly because they don't want to incur the social costs. And that's not good.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. And that is a part of what happens today is the pile-on. When someone says something that is not on the list of things you're supposed to think or say, and you can get piled on.
Yeah, and then there's guilt by association, right? And it goes like this, right? David Duke is an imperial wizard of the KKK. David Duke obviously opposes affirmative action. You oppose affirmative action. Ergo, you're David Duke.
Right.
And of course, there is no ergo, right? I mean, this
Of course.
this is like a fallacy that third grader could see through, but it's all around us.
Yeah, that's a real problem with today. Guilt by association. Yeah, it's there's so many complicated questions that you oftentimes feel like you have the answer to, or you have your opinion on it, and then you'll hear a very nuanced perspective from someone who takes a different stance. And if you're open-minded, you go, oh, maybe I haven't considered that point of view. And that's one of the real reasons why it's important that you have free speech and you have debate, because you don't want to get pigeonholed into an idea that maybe somewhere down the line you might find foolish, but you weren't allowed to be exposed to some really good arguments to the contrary.
Right. And, I think at the end of the day, for me, this is really a question about learning. I mean, I'm a teacher. That's my vocation, right? Mm-hmm. How do we learn from each other? And I think that the way we learn from each other is when we're examining as many different sides of a question as we possibly can, right? Mm-hmm. That's how you learn. Like, how many people learn from someone that they agree with? I don't really remember the last time I did. It's like, oh, Trump, yeah, I hate him too, right? And I do loathe Trump, but I don't learn from somebody that loathes Trump because I already loathe him, right?
Some people have some good loathing points, though.
They do.
You never know, man.
No, there are different ways to loathe Trump. I'll
you
acknowledge
might find
that.
out some facts that you weren't aware of about, like construction dealings and
right. No, there's plenty to loathe, and there are always new things to learn.
Yeah.
But I think just the larger point for me is that I think I'm more likely to learn from a conversation with somebody who actually likes Trump, precisely because I don't.
Right. Yeah, it's just hard to find rational, intelligent people that are open-minded, that oppose each other, that will sit down and have a conversation where they're not trying to browbeat each other or bully each other into submission. They're not trying to win the conversation, but they're honestly going, okay, so why do you feel like that? What is it about this that gets you excited? What is it about this that makes you upset? Okay, well, I looked at it this way. And then they go, well, I don't think that's right because of this. Then you go, oh, okay. Like
trying to learn.
If you can do that open-mindedly with people that you have opposing viewpoints, I've gotten better at that. That's one of the things that I've really gone out of my way to try to listen to people and try to look at things from their perspective, even if I don't agree with it. Try to just find where they're connecting the dots. Like, how are you doing this? Right. Okay, let me see how you do. And sometimes it's interesting. Like, sometimes you can see the logical fallacies that they've fallen into, and you go, oh, look at that. They fucking slipped right on there. And
Look, I think that's a great ambition, but I think that that's the exception because I think most of our media environment promotes the opposite, right? I mean, just think of what a news feed is, right? A news feed is the events of the day curated according to your search history and your biases.
Yeah.
And what an awful image, like time for your 2:00 feed, right? Of all the stuff that we have curated in order to reinforce your biases. That's what it is.
There is
That's
that,
where we live.
but quite honestly, my news feed is pretty. It's pretty innocuous. My news feed is all like new cars that are coming out, and this jiu-jitsu match has been postponed, and it's like
it's not all politics, right? Of
mine
course
is not
right.
politics.
Yeah.
I don't care.
Yeah.
When I'm looking at things that are interesting to me, I am only looking at things that I'm looking for distractions and things that are my hobbies. Like my news feed has professional billiards on it, so I'll get like snooker scores or snooker from the UK, and when something like deep and meaningful, if I'm looking for something, if I'm researching something, then I go look for that. You know, I don't like that stuff in my news feed because I figured out like a year or two ago, like I'm tired of getting freaked out. I don't want to just pick up like, Jesus, what is he doing now? I don't want to do that every time I pick up my phone. What's happening? What is it? North Korea? Shit. Right. I don't want to do that.
It's exhausting.
It's exhausting, and I don't think it benefits me. But I do like to be informed. So I, subscribe to the Washington Post, and I subscribe to Wall Street Journal and New York Times, and I'll go there, and I'll go on purpose to read.
Right, and to read different sources.
Yes.
I mean, I think that's what we haven't educated people to do, and that's what our broader media environment discourages.
I'm having a hard time finding a good Republican, a right-wing perspective that's a news source, though.
Yeah.
Like, do you know of one?
It's hard. I mean, it's hard. Look, I mean, you mentioned the Wall Street Journal.
They're fiscally... Yeah, but they're a little social justice-y with some of their op-eds.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a big difference between the news side of that paper and the opinion page.
Yeah.
But I think the Wall Street Journal is a really good source.
Yeah.
And what I do in the evenings is I just toggle between Fox and MSNBC. Because I know that if I were to watch, yeah, well, my wife thinks so. I mean, the reason though is if I watch MSNBC, I'll just see my worldview confirmed.
Do you ever read Matt Taibbi's Substack?
Yeah.
Did you read Rachel Maddow as Bill Riley?
No, I read
Bill
about
O'Reilly.
it. I haven't read it
It's
yet.
fucking great.
Yeah.
It's great. He made that same point in what's it called? Hate Speech? Is that his book? Hate Inc.
Yeah.
Hate Inc. is a book that he released last year that's phenomenal. I'm just a giant fan of Matt Taibbi. I think he's one of the most important journalists today because he's so honest and so open-minded and he's so well-informed. When he goes off on a subject, like he has put in the work. Like when he went off on savings and loan crisis, or when he went on, the subprime mortgage business, and he had to go. He actually interviewed him on the podcast about it. He had to learn all that shit. Like he's a journalist. He's not a finance guy, and so he had to really understand what kind of fuckery these people were involved with, and then put it in his beautiful prose so that it's like it dances on the page as you get informed about this fucking criminal behavior that led to this, gigantic financial crash that we endured.
And yet at the same time, I mean, look, I think it's great that Substack exists and it's great that a fellow like that is on it. But the fact that he's on it and that he's not writing for one of our major media companies, that says something troubling about this configuration.
I think he still writes for Rolling Stone.
I guess he does.
Yeah. He's still a Rolling Stone contributor.
Yeah.
But yes. Listen, and I've said this when people say, oh, I can't believe they wrote that about you. That's not true. Clickbait is what you have to do today if you want to stay alive. I don't hate the player. It's the game. The game is, look, no one's buying physical newspapers anymore. So with the absence of sales of physical newspapers, it's all about clicks. Now, if you tell the truth, like completely in the title, you're going to lose a lot of your business. You have to kind of distort things.
Well, I should tell you, I read 2 print newspapers at the first thing every morning. But
Good for you.
I'm like the last American to do that.
Good for you.
In fact, the Onion ran a great headline a couple of years ago that said, I believe it was last print subscriber to Boston Globe dies.
I used to deliver the Boston Globe.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I used to deliver the Boston Globe, Boston Herald, and the New York Times.
Yeah.
That was my job when I was a young man.
I was a paper boy as well.
Were you?
Yeah. Washington Post. Yeah.
It's a good job for discipline. Gets you up in the morning.
Yeah.
Taught me a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, and now, I mean, well, there are a whole bunch of reasons for this, but, the most of the circulation is done by adults in cars.
That's what I did.
Yeah. Oh, you did?
Yeah, I did in car. I had hundreds of houses that I would go to. I could make a good living.
Yeah.
Like, not really, but I can make enough money in a couple hours a day where I didn't really have to have another job.
Right. I did the same thing in high school. My friends worked at, sporting goods stores and grocery stores, and I got up and delivered the paper, and I made more money than they did.
Yeah. You just have to have the ability to get up 7 days a week early in the morning. It's a grind.
Yeah.
But in the absence of print journalism, where you could just go and buy a paper copy, they lose out so much money. Because it used to be, there was the machines, you put the money in, you pull a paper out, and remember there's an honor system?
Yeah.
You open the box and you get all these papers, and you're only supposed to take one. You remember those days?
Oh, yeah.
That's an interesting time. That would never happen today. where you could put a quarter in and you open that sucker and you're supposed to take one paper.
But see, there are other virtues of it, I think, that we tend to underappreciate. And the reason that I read in print is there's a lot of evidence that you retain more that way than you do on a screen. And
why is that?
Well, it depends on whom you ask, but the people that study eye tracking say that for whatever reason, when you're reading print, your eye goes all the way across on each line. And on screens, it's less likely to do that. You can't make this up. They call it the F pattern. When the eye trackers look at what you do on a screen, the first line you go all the way across, but then the next one, as in an F, it's a little shorter.
Oh,
and
interesting.
when you give people the same text, in print and on a screen, they just retain more in print. And I tell my students this. I say, when you can print something out, I know you can't always, because you will hold on to more.
I have a Kindle that has that paper screen.
Yeah.
How's that?
Yeah.
Is that the same?
I don't know.
Because it looks like paper.
And look, I think that obviously things are changing so rapidly, right? It may well be that future generations are socialized in a different way, and their eyes do different things.
Have you heard of? There's a new product. I've not tried it, but I've seen advertising for it. It's called Remarkable.
Oh, I read about it.
It's a tablet. Yeah. But when you write on it, you write it in handwriting.
Yeah.
And it can either save it in your handwriting or it puts it into print.
Yeah.
And it looks like paper, like as you're writing on it. But you can have, a gigabyte of information on this little tablet. So like thousands of pages. Like you could write books on that.
Yeah.
With just this pen. And the pencil apparently has a tactile feel. Do you know anything about it?
Yeah.
You ever use it?
I have one.
You got to. Did you show it to me?
No, just briefly, like a month ago.
A month ago?
I got it like a while ago.
But you didn't have it set up.
Yeah, I just haven't used it. I haven't done anything with it.
But that's what I'm saying. You didn't have it set up where I saw you use it.
I don't use it.
Yeah.
I just showed it to you.
When did you show? You just show it to me in the box?
Yeah, just pulled it out. I was like, here, check out the. You knew what it was. I was like, yeah, it's remarkable.
Why do I not remember that?
I don't know, because it was like 5 minutes.
My hard drive is so full. My brain hard drive is something is not that important. Like delete, get it out of there.
But I don't use it that much at all. It's just kind of sitting there, like my other iPad that I don't use.
I thought about it as a tool for writing jokes.
It might be helpful for that.
Yeah, because I think there's an app for your phone as well, right? Mm-hmm. So you could,
But it's just writing. There's no other apps. It does connect to the internet, but it's just so you can share stuff. I think.
Yeah.
But all these things, I think we're so close to these revolutions. It's hard to imagine what they're going to do to the way that we think, right?
Yeah.
And there was think about something like multitasking, right? So there was a guy at Stanford named Clifford Nass who died a year or so ago. He's quite young, unfortunately. And Clifford Nass was the guru of multitasking. And what he demonstrated is that multitasking is a hoax and that multitaskers have everyone snookered, including themselves. So they're not liars. They honestly believe that they can do 3 or 4 things at the same time with equal efficiency. It's just they can't.
Right.
They believe it. And so much in the media environment is encouraging us both to multitask and also to believe in multitasking, right? As an article of faith. It just turns out to be untrue. And he did it every which way with different sorts of sporting endeavors and card games and all kinds of different things. He said, do these 3 things separately and do them together, right? And if you do them one by one, you do them so much better. And this is another message I'm constantly giving to my students. Don't believe the multitasking hype. It is a hype. It is not true. Turn off everything else and work on one thing and then finish it and then go to the next. And it's hard, right? Because
that's why
it's hard.
That's why it's such a flex when you see a chess master play 10 people at the same time and walk around and fuck you. Not today.
Yeah. Well, there are exceptions to every rule, right? Those people can multitask.
Yes, but are they even multitasking? Because it's still the same endeavor.
Correct.
It's the same game.
Right. Yeah. They're playing one game.
Yeah, I think there's some real truth to that because I think most people that I know that multitask, they do several things. But I don't think they do them quite as good as if they were only doing that one thing.
Correct. The interesting thing is they actually believe that they do. And I think that was NASA's point. I mean, that's why it keeps going, right, is that we haven't gotten the message.
Yeah. That's not a good perspective. Like when you think you're doing something at your best and you're not,
look, we're all great self-saboteurs, and we're all great. We're not good judges of ourselves. We're biased. Right? All of us are.
Why is that?
Yeah. Well, Freud said that we're all narcissists at some level, right? And you want to be the winner, right? You want to be the person who beats the team at the buzzer and gets the girl and all these other things. And so that makes us incredibly biased judges of ourselves.
Yeah.
And we all radically inflate our abilities and our capacities.
But what about people that are very self-deprecating and are objective? Do you think even those people are full of shit?
I wouldn't go that far, but they might think they're even more self-deprecating than they are, right? Or better at self-deprecation than the next guy. And we're not good judges of that. Yeah.
That's very unfortunate. And there's probably some exercises to make you more objective.
Yeah. But getting married has been a good one for me.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
You got someone around you who's like, no, you don't. Fuck out of here.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult thing for people to do, to face themselves and to face like what they do good and what they do bad. And one way I've found is to engage in things that don't leave any room for fuckery. Right? Like martial arts is one of them. Another one is one of the reasons why I like pool is the balls don't care about your personality. They don't care about they don't care. Like either make the ball or you do not make the ball. Like you either can win or you lose. Like it's really simple in that regard. There's no but it's also very complex. It's like you either execute correctly or you don't. And so if you do things like that, like martial arts in particular is a very humbling thing. And I think it's really good in that way that most of the people that I know that are martial artists that are at an elevated state, they're really good. They're really friendly people. They're humble in a lot of ways. And one of the reasons why is because they're humbled all the time.
Yeah, because your ass is getting kicked all the time.
Yeah, if the three of us were all black belts and we were training together, we'd all be cranking each other's neck every day. Like you'd be tapping me every day and Jamie would be tapping me. And after a while, you're like...
That's not going to happen.
You just get used to it. You just accept the fact that someone got you and you don't... But when you see people that have never lost... I have a friend and we had this conversation and one of the things that we were talking about was the regret of him not doing sports when he was younger. Because he never learned how to lose. He never learned how to take a loss and just not have it emotionally devastate him. Yeah. So to this day, like even if he's playing a card game, it'll freak him out if he loses. Like he won't say anything, but it'll really bother the shit out of him. And some people, they don't have a lot of experience in testing themselves. So they don't have a lot of faith in their own character and judgment under pressure.
Yep.
That's unfortunate.
But it's interesting, Joe, that you prefaced all this with something about kind of what you're good and what you're bad at.
Yeah.
Because, the other thing I think that psychology has taught us is that actually that's a very bad way to think of yourself.
How so?
That is, the more you think about whether you're good at something or not, it turns out that generally the worse you do it at that.
Thing?
That's right. The best thing to do is not to think about it.
Right.
Because it turns out that when the brain starts to think about what's good and what's bad, it thinks of those in rather static terms. So like I'm good at math or I'm not.
But maybe that's in action of the thing.
Yeah.
But maybe not in reflection of the thing.
Right. And it can be both. But, in general, the best thing, when a student asks me, like, do you think I'm smart or do you think I'm good at history? I always say, I don't know and I don't care. All I care about is what you've written.
Right.
That's it.
The work.
This is not like an existential judgment of your soul. And by the way, the more you think about that, the worse you're going to do. Yeah. So don't do it. Don't do it. Because it makes you think in somewhat static terms. And I remember when my kids were growing up, like you would often hear, oh, so-and-so is good at this and so-and-so is good at that. So-and-so is bad at this. So-and-so is bad at that. And they tend to be self-fulfilling prophecies, right? And that's not good for anyone either.
Right.
So just don't think about it. Just do it.
Yeah.
Right? Don't think about whether you're, quote, good at it. Just do it.
Just do it. Yeah. But also recognize what parts of whatever you're doing that maybe you need to improve upon.
Absolutely, right? And, I think you can more easily do that if you're not thinking in these binary good and bad terms, right? Because if you think you're bad at it, like, why would you improve at it?
Right.
Really? You're bad at it.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, maybe you want to get better at it.
Maybe,
Yeah.
right? But that involves a belief that I think transcends this idea that people are good and bad at things. Yeah. Yeah.
But people do develop proficiency at things. And don't
No
you think
doubt.
there's some benefit in giving yourself like a little reward or letting yourself be aware that you've achieved some level of proficiency so there's a benefit
Right.
to all this discipline?
Without a doubt. And we've all experienced that, right? But I think the key, at least for me, is experiencing the action, right? Experiencing whatever it is, you're a great billiards game, and you finally able to hit that incredibly complex shot that you couldn't hit before. Instead of, wow, I'm a great billiards player, or I'm not, right? I hit that shot.
Right.
Yeah.
So just be more in tune with the action of doing it than your own
Precisely.
judgment of your abilities. Yeah.
Exactly, which is not useful. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. It's very Zen,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That's what you're supposed to be. Like Zen, that they actually discuss that in Zen of the Art of Archery.
Yep.
There's some, I believe that's in Zen of the Art of Archery, this thought about, not concentrating on the result,
Yeah.
but just like
Just do it.
go through the process.
Yeah.
Understand
Yeah.
the process, concentrate on the process.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That's the thing with martial arts. You don't think while you're doing it that, I'm really good at this. You just think.
You don't have time for
Exactly.
one.
You have to
Right.
just do it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm curious, Joe, since you were describing kind of all these moves growing up, how would you say, if somebody were to ask you, what have been the most important changes in the way you see the world since you were a younger person, either the political world, the social world, the environment, whatever it is? Like, what would you, if you compare yourself to your younger self, what would you say have been the most important changes in how you think and how you see the world?
I think the single biggest change that I can remember, single biggest shift that I ever had was having children. Because then I started thinking about everyone as grown-up babies. I used to think of people as being in a static state. Like if I met a guy and he was a 40-year-old guy, I'd be like, oh, there's Mike. He's 40. And then now I go, oh, Mike used to be a baby.
Right.
And then all the weird shit that happened to Mike in his life and the pros and cons and the failures and successes and the lies and truths and here he is.
That's what made Mike.
Yes.
That's what made Mike.
I have a lot more sympathy and empathy for people because of that. Because a lot of the people that I see now that are, assholes, if I met an asshole before, I'd be like, that guy's just an asshole. And then now I go, oh, that's a baby that like came out a bad product. Like what went wrong?
Well, you think like a historian. I mean, I'm a historian. And, when my kids were younger, they would always get annoyed with me and they would say like, Dad, when you meet somebody, why do you always say, where are you from? Like, that's so annoying. And the answer is, I'm a historian. That's what interests me, is, what are the communities and what are the experiences that made you who you are? And those things matter. Yeah.
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 It's a lot. It's everything. We are the culmination of our life's experiences and how we've absorbed them, along with our genetics, along with our environment. And environment is a critical factor because it's not just the environment in terms of like the city you live in, but the people that you hang around with.
Oh, yeah.
You know?
And the fact that you made all those moves and what that involved were different sets of people, right, in different environments.
That helped a lot.
Hugely important,
well,
right?
I went from San Francisco to Florida in the 1970s, and that was a big one because in San Francisco, we lived right near Lombard Street. It was like the heart of the hippie movement. It was saw hippies everywhere. Our next door neighbors were this gay couple that used to smoke pot and play the bongos with my aunt. They would all get naked and go next door and play the bongos and smoke pot. And like, with this couple, it was just a different way to live. It was just normal, to be around all these like hippies and like these long-haired guys. It was a strange place. It was a different place in the 1970s. And then moving to Florida, it was a total different environment. Now, I remember my friend who's a Cuban kid, and his dad was upset that gay people are getting married or getting the right to get married. So he had a newspaper. He was like, God damn it. He was like, threw the newspaper down on the table. He was real upset. And I remember being 11 going, how fucking dumb is this guy? Like, he cares whether gay people get married? Like, why do you care? Like, that is, what a weird thing to be upset by.
Right.
But I remember thinking that when I was 11, like, wow, like Florida's fucking different.
Right.
It didn't make any sense to me.
Right. But, I would argue that you learned a lot from that
Yes.
you wouldn't have learned if you had stayed on Lombard Street.
Yeah, for sure.
Right?
Yeah, if you live in that environment, you don't know
how other people are.
Yeah,
right?
you really don't know. It's just, it's so different.
Yeah.
It's like I remember I was 11 also. I went to school, and then I came home, and I asked my mom what the N-word meant. And she goes, you know what it means. I go, no, I don't know what it means. That's why I'm asking you. What does it mean? And she had explained it to me. I was like, really? Wow. Like, I'd never heard it before.
Wow.
Yeah.
And do you remember how she explained it? Like what her answer was?
My mom had me when she was very young. So she was a little dismissive. She was a little like, aren't you grown up yet? So in a lot of ways it's good because it forced me to like figure shit out for myself. But yeah, like I remember when I was in a car with my sister, I was about 7 years old, and I was asking my mom how babies were made. She's like, you know how babies are made. That was what my mom always used to say. You know. I go, no, I don't. She goes, I'm going to tell you, and you're going to laugh. I'm like, no, I'm not. And so she goes, okay. A man puts his penis in a woman's vagina. Bah! I thought it was the funniest thing. And she wouldn't leave me the fuck alone. She's like, no, you knew it, and you were trying to say it so that you would laugh. But no, I didn't know. You told me. Now I know. I didn't know. I was 7.
And do you remember how she explained the N-word? Like
she said it was a derogatory term for black people. I was like, wow. I remember thinking, whoa. So I didn't know what it was. Because I was 11. Right. You know, I guess in San Francisco I hadn't heard it. That's the only thing I could think of. Right. Because where we lived in San Francisco was very diverse. It was like the kids in my class, it was, I don't know, like 60-40 white and black. And a lot of Asian too. Not even white, black. It was like, I mean, I'm just making up numbers. It's hard to remember, but I remember there's a lot of different ethnicities in my environment, and we all hung out together on the playground. Hung out together. It was normal. Right. It was. It was a really open-minded place, man. In the 1970s, San Francisco, so open-minded. Everybody smoked pot. Everybody hated the war. And I remember when the Vietnam War ended, I was living in San Francisco, and I remember really clearly because I was a little kid and I was scared of the war. I was really scared because my stepfather he had not got drafted. He had gotten out of it. You know, they do the lottery, and he didn't get picked. So he was very fortunate that he didn't get picked, but he was really scared of it because he was of age at the time. Oh, wow. And I remember the war ended, and I remember thinking, whew, that's great. They finally figured out that war is bad, and now we're never going to do war again. That's really what I thought. So I was a little kid. I remember thinking that, like now, like good. I was born at a good time where they figured out no more war, and then Desert Storm happened when I was like 21. Yeah. And I remember thinking, these fucking dummies. Like I thought we figured this out. I thought we're not going to war anymore. What is this shit?
Did your biological dad serve in the war? In Vietnam?
No, my biological dad, I don't know him.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I haven't spoken to him since I was like 7 years old.
Wow.
Yeah.
So does he know that you're Joe Rogan?
His name's Joe Rogan too. Isn't that funny?
Wow.
Yeah.
So he must.
He must. Yeah.
Right.
For sure.
But you don't know.
No.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And do we know if he has another family?
Yeah, he does.
He does.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Wow. And you're not you don't want to know what he thinks about Joe Rogan? You
know what, man? Having kids, I could not imagine not talking to my children. I can't imagine it. I couldn't imagine it.
Yeah.
So someone not talking to me, I'm like, okay. You know, I don't hate him. Good luck.
Yeah.
Enjoy your life. But my stepdad was a really good guy, and it taught me a lot about my relationship with my kids. Like what I know what it feels like to have a biological parent out there and they don't contact you.
Right.
They don't reach out to you. They never find you. They don't seek you out. They don't. And you grow up like that going, maybe he'll call me one day. And then never do. Maybe he'll try to find me. Never do. It's bad, but it's good.
What's good about it?
What's good is it makes me understand as a father how important the bond between parents and the children are. It means a lot. It means a lot to me. And it's good because it gave me a challenge to understand myself for who I actually am without being under the pressure of achieving an image that a father wanted me to live up to, or that someone else's perspective of who I should be or how I should behave or how I should think about the world.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I was allowed to think about the world through my own experiences.
But didn't your stepdad play that role in
He
some
did,
ways?
in some ways, yeah. He did. It's different.
Yes.
It's always going to be different. Stepdads and kids, it's always going to be, especially if they don't have biological kids of their own, because it's a confusing process that happens to you. Do you have children?
I do, yeah.
You know what it's
They're
like. They're
adults.
So it's a confusing process that happens to you when you have children, when they're babies, and then you're right, and then you see them grow up, and you're like, wow, this is a different. I have a different life. This life is so different now. It's not just simple as now there's a baby. It's like you're not the same thing anymore. Now you're a father.
Yes.
And you have to adjust. You have to adjust the way you think, and you have to think of the way you communicate with them. You have to think of like you're helping mold their view of the world, and you have to communicate by example. You have to, acknowledge mistakes. You have to. One of the things I always do is whenever I correct my kids with anything, I always say, "Listen, I did everything you have done wrong. I did all of it, and I'll tell you what I did. I screwed up everything I've ever done." I'm like, I made mistakes my whole life. I did things and I lied to my parents. I did things and I pretended I didn't. Everything that you've ever done wrong, I've done wrong 10 times as bad. So I'm not judging you. It's just a part of being a person.
Right.
And I go way out of my way to explain that. So every time something's wrong, every time something happens, I always go, I did all this.
It's interesting you use the term mold because back to our earlier discussion, I think both with parenting and being a teacher, and I'm both, I think the other really hard thing is, how do you also cultivate somebody's autonomy?
Yes.
And let them be different from you.
Yeah, mold's maybe not the best word, right?
But you have to do both, right? Mm-hmm. Because there are some things you have to indoctrinate. You just do, especially when they're younger. Like we're not going to have a discussion about whether it's appropriate to take your turn. Or, to take a more pregnant example, to call somebody the N-word, right? We're not going to debate that, right? We're just going to tell you, like, this is right or wrong. But then things get more complicated, right? Because there's lots of gray in the world as well. And they've got to figure that out for themselves.
Yeah, you got to leave room for conversations, too, because sometimes kids just really want to talk to you and try to figure things out with you.
Yes.
And sometimes that helps the most. Sometimes just like you got to get them alone too. When the two of them are together, sometimes it's like, hey. You got to get. I really love taking one kid and going places with them, and just having conversations.
Yes, I love that too.
And just letting them complain about school. You know what my teacher said? Like, wow, that's crazy. And you let them, let them talk about. It's interesting when kids are really tuned into uninspired people. When there's an uninspired person telling them what to do. Or teaching a class, like they're really tuned into it. And there's a real lesson in that, because when kids have enthusiastic teachers, they love those teachers. They want to tell you about it. Yeah. Oh, Mrs. Wilson, she's the best. She's so much fun. She gets there. We all love her. And, it's like, it turns out Mrs. Wilson loves her job, right? So when you go there, Mrs. Wilson smiles at everybody and she's like, good job. And she high fives kids. And then everybody's like, I love that lady. And then there's some people that just want everybody to shut up, and they just get mad at you if you didn't do your homework correctly, or they,
Yep, and they resent you, right? The Mrs. Wilsons of the world, they don't do that. They understand that you're growing, right? And people do that in different ways at different rates, and they're going to encourage you along the way. You
Yeah.
know, but it's hard to find people like that. That requires Herculean patience. You know,
You have to be a special
And-
kind of person to be that kind of a teacher.
Yes, absolutely.
But I think there's a great benefit in being around bad teachers too. And one of the things I was telling my kids, one of my kids had a really bad teacher last year at their old school.
Mhm.
And I said, it sounds terrible, but there's a great lesson to be learned being around a very miserable person like that.
Mhm.
Because, you need to be exposed to shitheads. Like, shitheads are important. Like, this person, like, this teacher would call kids stupid. Like, you need to be exposed. And I'm like, I know it seems dumb, but you need to be exposed to people like that. You need to know that they're real, and it'll help you appreciate the
Right.
Mrs. Wilsons.
Well, I guess, Joe, you were exposed to somebody like that with your dad.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Right? How old were you when he took off?
Well, my parents split up when I was 5, and my mom and my stepdad and I and my sister moved to San Francisco when I was 7.
Okay.
So that was the last time I spoke to him.
And how old were you when you stopped hoping that you would talk to
That's a
him?
good question. I don't know. I think once I got really into martial arts, that's all I thought about. And then I sort of buried him with that in my head. But I didn't really even realize it until I started doing psychedelics and smoking pot, thinking how much of an effect it actually had on me.
Huh.
That's when I really thought about it. And I'm like, wow, that really fucked with me when I was a kid. And I was kind of in denial about it. you know?
Right, which isn't always the best way either.
No, I mean, that's really that's a giant problem with poor people, where sons grow up without father figures. They become very angry.
Mm-hmm.
That's the angry young man. It's a real issue, and there's this sort of unquenchable anger. Like, it's hard to put that fire out. You try to put it out, and the cinders are just still there.
Right.
The embers are still hot.
Right. And so was it martial arts that helped you quench the embers?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. My parents talk about to this day. There's two versions of me. There's like the version of me where it's like really angry kid, and then the version of me that was really calm, and it was post martial arts.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a fantastic vehicle for developing human potential. And for me, it was the right one. For some people, it's piano, right? For some people, it's
Yeah.
it could be anything.
Yeah. Or painting.
Yeah, anything.
Right.
Anything where you pour yourself into it, and then you learn, like, you're expressing yourself, like whatever this feeling, this emotion, this energy you have inside of yourself, you express it through your art.
Right.
And for me, it was I
Right.
needed something physical too. I needed something where I just got my anger out and, hitting a punching bag, and just something. There was something
Right.
physical about it too, but then also the discipline of learning something.
And you must have had some good teachers for that too.
Yes, I got
for
very
it to
fortunate.
work.
Very, very, very
Yeah.
fortunate
Yeah.
that I ran into an amazing school and amazing teachers. But I think for young people, learning something and getting good at it is so critical, because it teaches you that you used to suck at something, but you got better at it through hard work and dedication.
Yeah.
And that is applicable to everything.
Right. And back to the earlier discussion, actually you didn't suck. You just thought you did.
Yeah.
Right?
Well,
you had an image of yourself as either incapable or, just
inadequate.
right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And most people do.
Yes.
Most people growing up in particular, when they're young, they have this, that's the one thing that young people struggle with, I think, more than anything, is insecurity. I think that's also where bullying comes from. That comes from insecurity. And you don't think you see very many secure bullies.
I'm curious, do your kids do martial arts?
They did for a bit, but I don't push.
Yeah.
I'm not like, I let them beat me up. I still let them kick me and punch me. Like, I teach, because if they can hurt me, I'm like, if you can hurt a grown man, like, you actually know how to do it right. So I teach them how to leg kick and stuff. But they got into other stuff. They got into other sports. They're into sports. But, I want them to just, whatever. I don't think there's a path. There's like, your path is different than her path is. Just go have fun.
There is
Find
not.
things.
Something I love about teaching college students is that they're old enough to start understanding the world, but they have no idea what their role is going to be in it. And so it's really a magical time. I think like 19 and 20-year-old human beings are the most interesting people on the planet.
Yeah.
Because they can see things, and they're often very aware of how the world is working, but they have no idea what their role is going to be in it.
Right.
And so they're much more interesting than you or me, or at least than me.
Well, they're so...
Because, like, the game is sort of up for me. I mean,
Yeah.
like, I've made my choices. I've done the things that I
Right.
do, and that's kind of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
There's so much potential, but also so much insecurity.
Well,
Like,
it's
do you
scary.
do you remember being a young man and not knowing how it was all going to turn out?
Totally. And it is scary. And frankly, it's scarier now. I mean, and I think, look, I went to college in the late 70s, and it was a different world.
Mm-hmm.
And I never once remember thinking, gee, am I going to be like a burden on my parents? Am I going to be unable to get a job or sustain myself? Right? Because the United States, I mean, it had like a hegemonic role in the world that it does not have now. And, it was just a time of much more national confidence, I think. And, I have a lot of empathy for people in my daughter's generation and in my students' generation because they don't have that same kind of certitude. So I do remember kind of wondering, but I guess I didn't feel the same sense of pressure or fear. Like, I think that because America still ruled the roost, it was easier to think, gee, it's going to work out.
But weren't you worried about Russia when you were young and in college? Didn't you worry about the Cold War and all that jazz?
Yes and no. I mean, everyone read Failsafe and everyone watched movies about, the Cuban Missile Crisis and Red Dawn and all of that. But let's also remember that I'm not that old, and by the time I get to young adulthood, I'm going to turn 60 shortly.
You look great.
So do you, Joe.
Thank you.
Yeah, but coming from you, that's quite a compliment. How old are you?
53. Almost 54. I'll be 54 in a couple months.
All right. Yeah, I mean, look, by the time I get to a young adult, I mean, the Soviet Union is starting to implode. I mean, this is really the twilight of the Cold War, right? Is the 1980s, when I was a Peace Corps volunteer, I remember listening to Radio Moscow, because I was in Nepal and I had a little shortwave radio, and only two things came in: Voice of America and Radio Moscow. And Voice of America had its issues and its own brand of propaganda, but just listening, even just the sound values of Radio Moscow, it was so hilariously poor.
Really?
Like, I just remember thinking, this is not, like, we're going to win this struggle. It's really not a struggle at all.
That's funny.
Like, yeah.
Because we had this distorted perception of the powers of the Soviet Union when I was in high school, where we thought of them as being just like America, but over there, like in terms of their firepower and their financial means.
Right.
And that's what Reagan kind of did to them, like, spent them into a corner.
Well, that's part of it, and also, I mean, they didn't do a good job getting things to people, right?
Yeah.
I mean, David Reisman, who was one of my favorite authors ever, I mean, during the height of the Cold War, he wrote this great piece where he said, if we want to win this, all we have to do is just fly planes over Russia and just drop nylon, right? Because we know the women want nylon pantyhose. You can't get them in Russia. And, again, once they've put those on, right, they're not going to stand for it. And I think, a version of that actually happened.
Yeah, well, they realized that communism doesn't provide incentive.
And like, it's not fun to stand online to buy coffee.
Right.
I mean, like, it isn't.
No.
Who wants to do that?
Yeah. It's there was always this fear hanging over our head in high school, though, of a nuclear war.
Yeah, no, I do remember that. And you remember the TV show The Day After? That might have been a little before your time. But,
what is that?
It's basically, a horrible imagination of a nuclear attack.
Oh.
Right? And there were other novels about that. Alas, Babylon was a bestseller, and it's just kind of what's going to happen after the big one. In Alas, Babylon, by the way, somebody trades a jar of peanut butter for a Jaguar. And the reason is you can't get any petrol, you can't get any oil. Right? And the guy's really hungry. He's like, take my Jag. You're not going to be able to drive it anyway.
Wow.
And so, I do remember that. And, I also remember, the anti-nuclear movements, and, SANE and the other campaigns around that. And, Reagan was an interesting figure because, it's true that we often credit him for winning the Cold War, but obviously that victory was a long time in coming. And Reagan also, in his own way, he trivialized it. He would make jokes about like when the bombing is going to start. He would say, yeah, the bombing is going to start in 5 seconds. And everyone was supposed to laugh about that, and we didn't. Yeah.
Yeah. Reagan was famous for that one speech that he made in front of the United Nations where he was talking about how quickly we would come together if we were faced with a threat from an alien world.
Yeah.
I remember that because I remember all the conspiracy theorists got so jazzed up. They're like, finally, we're going to know the truth. The aliens are coming.
That was like crack for them. Yeah.
That's the best. I mean, there is no better distraction for like a giant percentage of the population than to tell them the aliens are coming.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, H.L. Mencken 100 years ago, he had this great quote where he said something like, for every deep social and political problem, there's typically a solution that is simple, attractive, and wrong. And that's what conspiracy theories are, right? They're simple, attractive, and wrong.
Many of them are simple, attractive, and wrong.
Yeah.
Some of them are surprisingly accurate. That's what's scary.
Right. Well, I think, unfortunately, and this is where the history piece comes in, one reason that Americans tend to believe in conspiracy theories is that the government is engaged in conspiracies.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
I mean, if you're trying to put like LSD on Fidel Castro's cigar, which the United States did, right? Then let's just say there's a crying wolf problem, and it becomes easier for people to believe that the government is engaged in perfidious conspiracies after the government is engaged in a perfidious conspiracy.
There's a fantastic book called Chaos by Tom O'Neill, and it's all about the Manson trials.
Yeah.
Have you ever read it? Have you heard about it?
I have not. Yeah.
It's amazing. Yeah. It's the craziest story because Tom was a neighbor to my friend Greg Fitzsimmons in Venice. And he had been working on this book literally for 2 decades. What happened was he got hired to write a story for a magazine on the anniversary of the Manson murders. And so he's writing the story, and as he's doing research to write the story, he starts realizing, like, holy shit, like there's a lot more to this than I thought. He gets deeper and deeper and deeper into it, and he finds out that the Manson thing was connected to these CIA mind control experiments that they were doing during the 1960s. And Manson had been, for sure, sheltered along the way, released from prison every time he got arrested for something. And they were all saying, this is above my pay grade. We were told to release him. And that he was involved in these, I forget what prison it was, but they were doing these LSD experiments on prisoners.
Yes. I mean, this is one of the most horrible chapters. I mean, speaking of conspiracy theories, I mean, you mentioned hallucinogens earlier. I mean, the federal government was involved in, developing and testing these substances during the Cold War. And it was very much about the Cold War. It's interesting you mentioned the Soviet Union because the history there is they first developed them because they thought it was going to be a truth serum.
Yes.
So you capture somebody from the other side and you feed them this. But then when they did these horrible experiments in jails and psychiatric institutes, they found out it was the opposite.
Yes.
And then they started to tout it as something that we would give our agents. So if you ever captured, you dose, and then you would just blabber and say the eels are in my hovercraft. So they always had that. That's one of the terrible logics about the Cold War is you could shift on a dime, right? And you could basically make the same plea just in the inverse way. So it's not a truth serum, but now it's something that we can just use. So when our agents get caught, they won't tell the truth.
Well, it was also these agents were given autonomy to run these tests and these studies. And they did some wild shit. And one of them was called Operation Midnight Climax. And Operation Midnight Climax, the CIA ran brothels. And they would watch through two-way mirrors, and they would dose these Johns up and have these poor guys just like tripping on acid and not have any idea what happened. And they would listen to them talk to the prostitutes.
Yeah, it's an awful chapter. And then, people made pranks too. You might have read that like one day in the 50s, somebody spiked the punch at Langley, like the Christmas punch at a CIA party.
Really?
And a bunch of agents like checked themselves into psychiatric hospitals because nobody told them. It was just like, oh, this is gonna be madcap.
We got some acid running around.
This is gonna be zany.
Wow, they had some leftover acid from some other creepy experiments. Well, you've been used to doing that to people. You probably think it's funny to do it to your coworkers.
Right, or you're right, and you're just a sadist. Right.
Well, they had a Haight-Ashbury clinic, free clinic that they operated, the CIA operated for decades, and they closed it down just a couple months after this book came out. They're like, okay, time to close up shop, boys, because this book was so detailed, and Tom had spent so much time poring over all of the documents and the data, and he had dotted all his I's and crossed all his T's, and at the end of it, you read the book, and you're like, holy shit.
Right, and I think that's where the history piece is really important. I mean, conspiracy theory is a huge problem in our society right now. There's no question about it. But again, like...
conspiracies can occasionally be real.
And if you don't want people to believe in them, don't do them.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's, don't have secret LSD experiments that go for 20 years.
Right.
Don't do that. Yeah.
I think they went for 40.
Yeah, I know.
Maybe even more.
Yeah.
When it comes to free speech, what we have now is just, we have words that we express, and these words convey intent and thought and the way we perceive the world, and we each take in the other person's words and the way they're saying them and try to go, okay, I see where you're going with this. One of the things that weirds me out most about the future is all of these sort of symbiotic human electronic things, gadgets that are being proposed, like Neuralink, like Elon Musk's thing, where Elon told me, specifically said, you're going to be able to talk without using your mouth.
But wasn't Joe then in the interview where you shared a blunt with him?
No.
Okay. All right.
That was two before.
Okay.
Neuralink, I think, was the second interview I did with him, or maybe the third. I think it was the third.
Right.
Not sure.
Right.
No, I think it was the second. Was it?
I think it was the second.
The second. Yeah. But when he said, you're going to be able to talk without words, I meant, and he was so confident about it. It's like, you're going to be able to talk without words. And if anybody else said that, I'd be like, sure, dude. But when Elon Musk says that, you're like, fuck, we're going to talk without words. Like, immediately I started thinking, well, maybe that would be good, because it's going to be a rough transition. But it was probably a rough transition to go from grunts to language. But you don't want to go back to grunts.
No, you don't.
So maybe this is how because biology takes so long to catch up, and electronics are so rapid in the technological innovation.
Right.
So maybe that's how we bypass all of our monkey genetics. We get someone who's probably a fucking robot to figure out this thing where they cut a hole in your head and put this device in that has all these electrodes into your brain. And now this monkey's playing Pong with his brain. Do you know about this now?
I think I read something about it.
Yeah, this monkey's using Neuralink.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean,
look at this smart-ass monkey.
Yeah.
I don't want to play him. I'd be scared.
Right.
This monkey's got some skills.
Yeah, that looks like one of the early video games.
Mm-hmm. It does.
Yeah. Pong. It looks like Pong.
I had one of those.
Yeah.
Did you have that?
Well, no, but when I was in the Peace Corps, my friends and I would play it with flashlights on the ceiling, because we were in Nepal, and we were in a place with no electricity or running water, and we found many ways to amuse ourselves, but one was by inventing a beer pong game, which you did with a flashlight on the ceiling.
Wow.
Yeah,
that had to be
people
bizarre,
won't do that.
like being in the Peace Corps in Nepal. Like, how long did you do that for?
2.5 years.
Wow.
And
pull this sucker up a little closer to you.
Okay, yeah. Is that good?
Yeah, I just want to get it. They're very directional to keep the rest of the noise out.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, I was very lucky. Like so many other things in my life, I was sent to Western Nepal, to a place that was about a 3-day walk from vehicular traffic at the time, and I was the first white person anyone had ever seen. And some of the kids thought I was a ghost. They called me Bhoot, which means ghost in Nepali.
Wow.
And just as a young person, as a young American, to go to a community like that, and to really become a part of it. I lived with a family that took me in as one of their own.
Oh, wow.
And I named one of the babies that was born. Which
really?
Was a real
what
honorific.
Name?
I gave her the name Santi, which was my favorite female Nepali name. It means peace. And I just thought it was so cool that there are people walking around whose name is Peace. I mean, that sounds, you probably had friends over on Lombard Street in San Francisco that had that name. And that's kind of what it reminded me of. But as part of that ritual, I had to do a number of things, including eat rat meat and drink cow urine.
Wow. What's
and
worse?
That was the cow urine for sure. The rat meat tastes like chicken. It's just like the joke, right? I mean, you cook meat, any kind of meat, it's mostly going to taste like chicken.
Have you ever seen that? There's a sacred temple in India where they feed the rats every day, and the rats have become very domesticated, and they drink out of the same water as the rats.
I've read about it. Yeah.
It's really wild to watch, man.
Yes.
Because instead of thinking of rats as being this vermin pest, like we think of them as here, where everyone like, oh my God, it's a rat, and they step on it or they run away, and the rats run away from you. In this temple, the rats don't run away from anybody, and these are wild rats. You ever seen it?
They've been socialized. Yeah.
Have you seen it?
Yeah.
On video?
No, I haven't.
You need to watch.
Yeah.
See if you can find a video of it because it's very strange. It's really interesting because these people are eating with the rats and they're drinking milk that the rats are drinking. It's really crazy.
Yeah.
The rats. Look at this. The rats are everywhere with these people, and these are not pets. You know.
Yeah.
And so they share the milk with these rats, and they don't worry about diseases. And look at these rats just hang out and chill. It's very straight. See the rat running around? Like, they don't have any fear of people because they're treated really well. And it's confusing, right? Because it's like, okay, is that the way to do it? Like, I don't think it's the way to do it, but look at what's happening in New York City. Like, New York, have you seen the documentary on Netflix, Rats?
I have not. Yeah.
It's amazing. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
And it shows, first of all, what kind of horrific diseases, like, so many rats carry.
Yeah, and I mean, they've, among other things, they brought bubonic plague to different parts of the world.
Yeah,
via
through
fleas.
mites. Yeah, fleas.
Yeah.
The rats that they found them in New York City and Philadelphia, and they show like what a complicated society these rats have.
Yeah,
like they have young dumb rats test things out before the smart, older, clever rats. The smart rat's like, yeah, some food over there, kid. Just go try it out. And they go over there and they die. And they're like, aha, poison.
Well, they're intelligent. That's why they've been featured in so many experiments, right?
Yes.
I mean, that's why so many lab psychologists work with rats, right? In Nepal, the reason that you ate a rat was the rat was considered the strongest animal. Oh. And you weaned kids on it. Because you want the kid to grow up to be strong.
Really?
Yeah, and so they would often wean kids and get just a tiny little piece. Yeah. The cow urine, that was the only time I actually took antibiotics prophylactically, which is something you're not supposed to do. But I just decided that, it was my second year. I didn't want to get ill.
Cow urine has some weird pseudo-medicinal purposes over there.
I've read that too, yeah. They're
using it for people that are suffering from COVID. And there was this this guy from... I'm trying to remember the country. I don't remember, but he was criticizing like how ridiculous this practice is of giving cow urine to these sick people, and how ignorant it was.
Well, it's funny you say ignorant because for me, really, what was so important about that experience was just learning how weird I was, and that is, how weird I was to them, and how many different ways there are to be human. Right, and so I participated in marrying off one of our sisters, right? Because I'm an older brother. The girl's 16. Time to get her married. And,
16.
Oh yeah.
How old was the dude?
Yeah. Well, people would come by and ask for a hand. This is what the process was, and often bring gifts. And I'm there with the other brothers, and a guy would come and leave, and somebody would say to me, well, what did you think of him? And the first time they asked, I said, "Boini lai kostelagyo," which means, what does little sister think?
Right.
And people just cracked up, and I heard about that for 2 years. I would walk to other parts of the district, and people would say, "Oh, I heard about you. You're the guy who asked what Boini thinks." And the point was that wasn't relevant to them. That wasn't what the experience was, right? That wasn't a relevant variable. And, I would explain to them that in my country, you actually chose your own spouse. And they would say, well, how do you do that? And I'd say, well, you find somebody that you love. And then they would say, well, then what if you don't love them? And then I'd say, well, there's this thing called divorce. And what I realized was that the way I thought about how all this should work was just so radically different from theirs, and not necessarily better or worse, right? Their system had its own logic, and it was static, it was stable, right? If you don't marry for love, right, you're not going to get divorced because you're out of love. Right? That wasn't the purpose of it. The purpose was it was social, it was familial, it had to do with joining communities, And again, I didn't grow up there, so that's not what I do or what I would want to do. But what I learned was how many different ways there are to do, how many different ways there are to be human. And always to resist the automatic assumption that your way is the better way. Because we all do that too. And by the way, I did some of that in Nepal. I mean, one of my other really enduring memories is my best student was of the so-called kami caste, which is metal worker, which is an untouchable. It's way down there, right? It's not as low as a shoemaker. And, they have a caste system, right? And at the bottom, there are people that are called untouchables because you're literally not supposed to touch them or anything.
What?
Yes. I mean, that's how, shoemakers especially, because they deal with
shoes.
With cows. They deal with leather, right? And they,
so why does that?
Well, because the cow is a sacred animal, right?
But you need shoes.
Yes, you do. Right, and so in the Hindu system evolved to have a caste that did precisely that.
Wow!
Right? I mean,
so did you communicate with those people at all?
Oh, sure.
What was it like?
Yeah,
they must have felt terrible.
Well, I mean, here's the story. The metalworking family. I actually went down to their house and I had a meal there. And I come back and I tell my amma, that means mother of my family, and we were Kshetris, which is way up there. It's not Brahmin, which is the highest, and that's the priestly caste. But the Kshetris are second. They were historically the military caste. She's like, Babu, that means baby, which is what she called me. Babu, you ate rice at a metalworker's house? Do you know how filthy those people are? What were you thinking? And I'm like, listen, Amma, I just don't believe in caste. I think everyone's the same. And P.S., what's going to happen? I wake up in the middle of the night and I'm just incredibly ill. And I just go outside and I'm puking my guts out. Amma can hear me. She comes from the other room and she's like, listen, Babu, you can't say I didn't warn you. I mean, and again, it was really useful for me. It's not like I suddenly believe in the caste system because I don't. Right? But I think it's really useful just to have all your assumptions challenged, and that's really what it did for me. And here I was, I'm this American, I'm making this great statement about how all people are equal. Well, you know what? I mean, 20 years earlier in my own country, they had a caste system, right? Yeah. That went back to the 1600s.
Right.
And that was the other formative experience of being in Nepal. That was actually the first place that I started to think about American history.
What did you... When they were talking about the arranged marriage,
yeah,
and when you were saying that in your country people get to choose,
yeah,
like what did you think about what is their like? How do they explain it to you in a way where it made sense? Did they attempt to, or did they just say this is how it's always been?
Well, I would say that the things that are most commonsensical to us often we don't have to explain, right? Because they're part of our ether.
Right.
But I think the logic was this, that you have to create families, right? And so
you have to.
Yeah, because you've got to, you have to perpetuate the species,
right?
Right. And so the simplest and the most static way to do that is to have the girls marry guys who have enough wherewithal to take care of them, right? That can bring you something, right? Because it's a reciprocal arrangement, right? Mm-hmm. And this is why in rural Nepal at the time, people wanted to have boys, not girls. They used to say, Choro bascha, chori jansha, which means the son stays and the girl goes. Because, of course, the system was also patrilocal, which means that, you go and live in the house of the guy that you've married. Right? So in the house I live with, the older brothers, they all had wives who lived there.
Wow.
Right? But when the girls got married, they had to go somewhere else. So that
bizarre.
was, yeah. Well, that again, and it's ironic because, believe it or not, 20 years later, I went back to my village with my older daughter, who was a junior in high school at the time. And the 3-day walk had become about a day's walk because they had cut a tractor road kind of up half into the mountains. And the first guy that I ran into, he just said, "Hey, where you been? Like, I haven't seen you around." And they're like, "Oh, you brought your daughter. Great. Let's drink rice wine." And basically, somebody had died and somebody had gotten married and, somebody had a kid. But the one thing that was really different, and this speaks to globalization, is a lot of the younger men had gone to places like the United Arab Emirates to work. And that was ironic too because the old story was the son stays and the girl goes, right? A lot of the sons had gone, but they had gone outside of the country, and that's the way so many of these economies work in that part of the world.
Did you see if the girl's marriage worked out?
Well, again, Joe, it all works out. Right? I mean, it works out because it was designed for social reasons, not for personal ones. It's not about what she thinks or about what he thinks. It's about kind of, bringing together families, creating communities, bringing up kids. It wasn't about sentiment. Although, I as I got closer to people in the community, I found out that after a marriage was arranged, often you did develop feelings for the person.
Often.
Yeah, it's just that those feelings weren't the foundation of it, right? They weren't what spawned it. They were an offshoot of it. They weren't a cause of it.
Did it make you feel uncomfortable that they were doing that?
Not in the least.
Really?
And in fact, I mean, that was when I started to read history because, of course, in most parts of the world, including where we are right now, historically marriage was arranged.
But I would imagine that, like, if you have this conversation with a feminist, for instance, they would have a real issue with that. And
Absolutely.
and also a real issue with your acceptance of it, right?
Well, again, I'm not saying that I accept it for me.
Right, I understand. Yes.
and because that wasn't my expectation,
Right.
But I think it's worth asking ourselves the degree to which we know we're right.
Right.
And I think that at the end of the day, we don't. All of us have opinions. All of us have biases. All of us have learned certain things. But Learned Hand, who was a famous jurist and federal court judge, one of the things he said that's always stuck with me is that the spirit of liberty, which is really what we're talking about, is the spirit that is not so sure of itself. And I've always loved that, right? So I'm a human being. I have biases, opinions, very strong ones. But I think that the worst human attribute is self-certainty. I think it's the most dangerous one, And for me, the Peace Corps was just a great way to challenge that and just say, okay, look, I'm not going to have an arranged marriage. And by the way, I don't. And I'm not going to marry off my daughters. But in another part of the world, they do that. And that's decreasingly the case, by the way, right? Because these places have modernized. Remember,
so they get the internet and they go,
time.
what the fuck? I can just meet a guy I really like.
Exactly, right? And so these, when we went back to Nepal, in my village, it was in a remote place, so it was relatively static, but there had been many other changes. I mean, just think of all these guys going to the UAE to work on construction sites.
Those are sad stories because I know that some of the guys that go to that part of the world, they go with the expectation of getting paid a certain sum of money, and then they take their passport and then they pay them a fraction of that, and they live in squalor.
Oh, it's horrible. And I actually went, this was an amazing experience. I went to teach in the UAE a couple of years ago. And it was fun for me because every construction site was full of Nepalis. And so I would just go up to the construction site and start speaking Nepali because I can still speak it and freak these guys out. And they would be like, okay, I've got to take you down the block to the next construction site. And I would go there and they would kind of show me, say, okay, say something. And I would. And they would go, ba-ba, which is what Nepalis do when they're kind of amazed.
Wow.
But the stories I heard from them about the subject you're describing, it was really sobering. I mean, I found great Nepali food there because, I love Nepali food. There's a Nepali community.
What is Nepali food like?
It's fairly similar to North Indian, but it's very simple. It's rice and lentils and whatever vegetable is in season. So that's what I ate for 2.5 years. Not literally, but it's let's just say that, goat is for a very special occasion, like when somebody gets married. This is a subsistence community, and so what I ate for 2.5 years was rice, dal, and whatever vegetable was in season. It's
Dal?
Dal is lentils.
Okay.
There's
a sheep called dal.
Yeah.
So I was confused.
So anyway, in the UAE, I would eat at this Nepali place, and the same guy would serve me every night. And I said, I saw this thing in the newspaper saying that, you have to get a bida, that in Nepali that means a holiday, like 1 day a week or something like that. And he said to me in Nepali, he said, yeah, and if I bitched about that, they just send me home and hire some other fucker. I mean, he said this to me in Nepali.
Wow.
And in the UAE, one of the things I learned is that only 10% of the people are from the UAE. Isn't that amazing? Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
And the rest of them all imported to work there?
Exactly. And here's the other thing about the UAE. There are no naturalized citizens.
Really?
So what that means is you can come and work for us for sure.
But you can never be a citizen.
You can't be us, right? We're sitting on a pile, or more specifically a pool of petrol, right? And we are not sharing.
Interesting.
And so, you can work for us, but you will not be us.
Vice did a documentary on the guys who built Dubai.
Yeah.
Well, built this very specific area, and they showed how they lived, and it was really disturbing. Really.
And again,
very, very sad.
You don't have any rights, right? I mean, you're there to work. But another thing that really stuck with me, I was teaching I taught at NYU at the time, and we had a campus there in downtown. Now it's outside of town. But one of the students there told me this really disturbing story that's right on point, which is she's walking home at night, and she thinks that there's this South Asian guy that's kind of following her. But you know how it is. Like, you're not really sure.
Right.
He seemed a little sketchy, but you don't know. So you sort of turn a corner and see if he turns it. And, she gets to where we had our campus, and she told the guard that she thought that this guy down the street had been following her. And she told me that, the police came in 10 minutes and they took him to the airport. It's just like, you fuck with us in any way, you raise an eyebrow, you're out of here, bro. It's
so
like,
did she even know if he was for sure?
No, and she felt terrible about it.
Wow.
I mean,
Maybe
it's like,
he was just going the same direction.
Precisely,
next thing you know, he's on a plane.
Right.
Fuck.
I mean, and she felt awful about it because, I mean, look, I think any woman has been in a situation like that. It's iffy. You're not really sure. It seems a little sketchy, and that's what she tried to communicate to the guard. It's like, look, I'm not really sure, right? But it's like, hey, you even raise an eyebrow? It's like you have no rights.
Oof. It's scary.
It's terrifying.
It's scary because that can be abused, obviously.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, someone can just decide for whatever reason that you've done something that you haven't done, and you're on a plane or in a jail.
That you're done. You're done.
Living in other cultures and recognizing that there's just different styles of living, that human beings can live in different ways, is very eye-opening because we're so accustomed to the way people live here.
Yeah.
We're so accustomed to it,
Yeah.
It's like I had Josh Rogan, the journalist, was here the other day, and he was talking about living in Japan because he was living in Japan at one time and teaching over there.
Yeah.
Or and doing not teaching. Excuse me. He was teaching English, right? Wasn't he teaching English as well?
Yeah, he's like 2 years.
Yeah, he taught English and he was working as a journalist there. And he was just talking about how different, the culture is. The culture is so different than it is here. And I was saying, that my experiences over there, it's almost like Tokyo seemed to me like if human beings evolved in a completely different dimension. They're human beings, but they evolved in a totally different style of life, but very similar. Where they have streets and buildings and neon, but yet they're really polite and orderly and very disciplined. And it's like, wow, this is crazy.
Yeah.
It's weird how there's these different styles of living.
And different gender ideas and norms for sure.
Yeah. Italy's another one. I've spent a lot of time vacationing in Italy. And those fucking people just want to relax. That's all they do. They just want to. It's so hard to find a gym there. Like, where's a gym? Like, the gym in the hotel was all fucked up. Like, nobody uses this gym. Like, they just want to relax. It's interesting.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah. And look, again, there's something to be said for that. I mean, my wife and I lived for a couple months in Greece about 5 years ago because my wife had a gig there. And one of the things we learned is that if you went out to dinner with somebody, if they invited you out, like, book 4 hours. It's sort of like Joe Rogan's show, 4 hours.
4 hours for dinner.
Yeah, yeah. And
multiple courses, keeps going.
And
wine.
ouzo, whatever.
Yeah.
And the Greeks we were hanging out with, mostly physicians, because that's what my wife is, and several of them had been to the United States, and they said the most barbaric thing about the United States, they thought, was how quickly people ate. And they said, in the United States, we heard somebody say, grab a bite. What is this grab a bite? And they just thought it was barbaric, and it kind of is.
It kind of is.
Yeah.
But if you want to do what we do, that's how you have to live.
Right. And
not necessarily good.
Again, it's like it's. I think that's almost asking good or bad. That's almost the wrong question, right? It's like
right.
Human beings are irreducibly diverse, and they found so many different ways to be human.
Mm-hmm.
And the more of those ways you can expose yourself to, I think actually the more human you become. You just see how many ways there are, like, to cut this pie.
Yeah, I think so too. I think there's real value in that. I've been taking my kids overseas since they were 2.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's real important just to take them around people speaking different languages and.
Oh, I mean, as I was saying earlier, except for meeting Susan, my wife, I mean, living as an elementary school kid in Asia, absolutely the central event of my life. And I mean, just one minor example, but it kind of isn't. When we lived in Iran, my dad was the director of the Peace Corps, so we lived in a very nice place, and we had servants and things like that because you're a Westerner living in an Asian place. And one night, the cook, we were watching clips about the Ali Frazier fight because this was 1969, and the cook says to me in Farsi, in which I was fluent, of course, because when you're a kid, you can learn a language in 3 weeks. He says, so this guy Ali and this guy Frazier, they're from your country, but they don't look like you. What's up with that?
Wow.
And as an 8-year-old in Farsi, I told Mahram, the cook, that African people had been enslaved and brought to the New World. And again, how I even said that or what sense I made of that, I have no idea. But what an incredible privilege that I was even in that situation.
Yeah.
And that I had, that I knew that, and then I was put in this position of having to explain it to this Iranian cook.
Who didn't understand it.
Well, I mean, I who knows what sense he made of it? I mean, really, who knows what sense I made of it?
I mean, didn't understand it before you explained it.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Wow. Growing up like that had to be amazing. What do you think? I think the 4-hour dinner thing, there's probably some great merit into it.
Yeah.
There's some great merit to it, rather, if you don't have a demanding job. So then the question is, should you ever have a demanding job?
How hard should you work? I mean, look, that's a reasonable question, too.
It's a reasonable question.
We face that in Greece because, Susan found this kind of funny. When it got super hot in the afternoon, at the hospital where she worked, they would just send people home.
Yeah.
They'd say, it's too hot. And we would just never do that.
Yeah.
We're just going to close up shop. It's really hot. Go home and take a siesta.
Right.
A lot of our recent experiences have been around medicine because she does a lot of international medicine. And another example that I thought was fascinating, we went to Chile because she was doing a gig at a hospital there. And at noon, all the docs stopped working and they went to a dining hall, a very well-appointed dining hall, and had a sit-down lunch. Everyone's beeper goes off. And, Susan spent her whole life in teaching hospitals in America. That doesn't happen. If you get, M&Ms for lunch, you're lucky, because it's go, 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 go.
Yeah.
And the Chileans, noon to 1, man, there are no patients, there's no nothing, and you sit down and have a meal. And it was pretty cool. Yeah.
A friend of mine produces television shows, and he went to Italy to film at the Lamborghini factory. And they just wanted to see, what's it like to put together an exotic automobile? What's it like being on the floor? And so he said they take 3-hour lunch breaks. They eat pasta and they sleep. And he's like, no wonder these goddamn cars are so expensive. This fucking takes forever to build them. He was laughing and joking, but he was like, man, the food's incredible. And he goes, and these people just relax, and they don't work all day.
Right. And look, there's something to that. I mean, who was the Henry Ford of Lamborghini? There wasn't one, right? I mean, Ford's genius was to make a car as quickly and as cheaply as you could, right? That lots and lots of people could drive, right? And that's not the goal of Lamborghini.
I think if I remember correctly, Lamborghini was created because somebody was working with Ferrari. And they're like, you know what? I can do this better. I think they got annoyed at how hard it was to get a Ferrari too, and so they're like, I'm just gonna make my own one of these fucking things. I think that's how it started, and they've been doing it for almost as long as Ferrari has too.
Yeah.
But it's like the Italians are great for whatever reason, or they have historically been great at food and art.
Yep.
Like food and art has been their thing.
Oh,
not so great at skyscrapers, not so great at, there's a lot of things they're not so great at.
Policing and crime fighting.
Right, but art.
Yeah.
Art and passion and there's a celebration of leisure and of just being a community, just being around each other and having fun and singing and laughing and dancing.
Yeah.
And it seems like they have their own way of living that suits them in a way that I don't know if our way of living suits us.
Right. And I think the jury's out, and that's the point.
Yeah.
Right.
We accomplish a lot.
Yes, we do.
But we're all
Some
fucked
of
up.
Us. That too.
I want to know which country has more like antidepressants and SSRIs and.
Well, I've seen some of that literature, and it turns out that these international happiness indexes, they kind of confirm the cliche that money really does buy you happiness. So
we're happy over here?
Well, not as happy as the Danes, right?
The Danes are the happiest.
The Danes are extremely happy, and when I say money, I'm not just talking about your income,
Aren't
right?
they just happy because they're beautiful? They're so handsome and beautiful women.
That's part of it,
men.
but really what it is that they have really good health care. They have all education, including higher education, is free. Right? And it turns out those things make you happy.
Sure.
Right? And, you shouldn't nostalgize poverty. I think sometimes there's this noble savage idea that, the people in such and such a country, they're poor, but they're very happy. No, actually they're not. And what makes you happy is, reliable health care, right? Full employment, right? Full, accessible education. And the people that have those things, the people that live in those countries are happier. Yeah. Yeah.
They don't create as much innovation and they don't create as much like world influencing art, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Right? So you got to wonder, like, is there a benefit to a certain amount of struggle and what's the sweet spot?
Right.
What's the sweet spot of being a young person and having no idea whether or not you're going to have your bills paid, whether you're going to be able to take care of yourself? What's the roadmap? What is your future going to hold versus someone who knows they get a stipend from the government, you're always going to have your health care, there's plenty of food. Maybe there's a middle ground.
I think there absolutely is, and I think that's actually, we're at a juncture right now where we're trying to work that out in the United States. I mean, I think that's what a lot of what we heard Joe Biden talking about in the State of the Union was about.
Did you pay attention to that?
Some of it, right? I mean,
you might be the only one.
You know what I paid attention to?
What?
And I think this is really to your point. The fact that there's been so little what I would call real Republican pushback of a sort of, there's been a little, but of the sort that we saw with the Tea Party in 2008, right, where you say, no, the state's too big, like, no, we don't want to provide all those services. It seems to me that, if we had what I would call a real Republican Party, we would be having more of that debate. Instead, it seems to be focused mainly on, Dr. Seuss, Mr. Potato Head, and something that's happening at the border, because I think that there should be an interesting debate about that. How big do we want the state to be? How many services do we want do we want to provide? What are the costs and benefits of that? I mean, to me, that's what I mean, those are the big questions.
Right.
And I think that, there are costs and benefits to that. I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat. I tend to support most forms of state welfare. But that's why I wish we had what I would call more real Republicans of the old variety, right, who were kind of making the case for smaller government, right, and making the case for, allowing, more room both to rise and to fall and all of that stuff.
Watchdogs of frugality.
Yeah.
People who are,
Again, that's not my jam, but I think that we should hear that.
Yeah, the problem with bigger government is government's not good at anything. So when they do it bigger, it's just more people being incompetent. If you could get, and I'm not a fan of hiring the private sector to take over important government jobs because I think they would cut corners too and make it the most profitable and instead of the most efficient. But it's just there's no outside. Trump is the Republican Party right now. Still, it seems like they're still hanging their hopes on him winning again in 2024.
Yes,
and maybe someone will rise between now and then.
And more nonsense about our cities being aflame and the border being a crisis. And both of those are largely invented. We have lots of much more serious stuff to deal with.
We do, but the border is kind of.
Yes and
bit
no.
of a crisis.
Look, it has been for a long time. It's been building for a very long time. But, when those reports come into your newsfeed or mine, here's what they don't tell you. They don't tell you that in the last 10 years, immigration declined to a level that we haven't seen since the 1970s. It doesn't tell you that in the past 10 years, 2/3 of our immigrants have come from Asia, not from Latin America. And they don't tell you that immigrants of all kinds, including undocumented, are less likely to commit crimes than native-born Americans. Those are all facts. And everyone should know them, and that should put the crisis in a little bit of a different context.
That's probably all very true. The difference between immigration and illegal immigration is when it gets squirrely.
Definitely, and that's all worth debating, right?
Yeah,
but
and
we're not gonna have that debate if we're just focused on there's a caravan that's coming up from Honduras and oy vey, and maybe George Soros is financing it. Look, the question of how many immigrants should come in, and also what do we do with the people that came in here illegally? Those are real questions.
Those are real
right?
questions. Yeah,
absolutely.
And also, the question is why do you have to have a special skill to be a valid immigrant?
Yeah.
That's a real good question because there's a lot of poor people that they've been doing labor their whole life, but they want to do better for their family. But you have to be able to provide a service that makes it valuable for you to enter into America.
That's right. And I don't know where your ancestors come from, but mine came from Poland, Russia, and Lithuania.
Mine were Italy and Ireland.
Okay, and they didn't have any of those skills. They couldn't get in now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Or it would be way, way harder.
And they got in easy. My grandparents just came in, signed their name, and they were in. What did you have to do back then? Not much.
Yeah.
The 1920s?
Right.
What the hell did you have to
until
do?
1925. Until they changed the immigration laws.
Yeah.
So, my relatives are lucky we got in before 1925 because we restricted it heavily after that and then changed again in the 60s.
Yeah. It's unfortunate that the disparity between the United States and these, especially these Latin American countries, these people are coming up and literally walking.
Yeah.
It's sad that they don't have a better spot down there. That's what's fucked up is that they need to come up here. That's what's crazy.
Is, right? And, I think it's fair to say that some of their woes, if you go back in time, also have to do with some terrible decision-making activity by the United States. That's not to say we're to blame for it, right? Because that's way too facile.
Right.
Right? But the United States does not have a good record of, let's just call it political intervention in that part of the world.
No.
And so, it's worth, this is where the history piece becomes really important. If you look especially at, a country like Panama or a country like, Nicaragua, right? Or Guatemala, you'll see in the past all sorts of American efforts to intervene in the politics of those countries in ways that were fundamentally destructive to those countries. And that's real.
Yeah, and the damage continues from the Reagan administration in Nicaragua, right?
Yeah, and El Salvador.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember all that Oliver North shit when I was a kid.
Yeah, that's like something out of a movie, and a really bad movie, by the way.
But a real movie. That shit was really going down. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah.
That they were using, and the fact that they were using cocaine sales from Los Angeles. I interviewed Freeway Ricky Ross. Do you know who he is?
I do.
Yeah, the real
He came
Rick Ross.
here. Rick Ross came here.
He
to
was
the
at
studio.
the L.A. studio.
Yeah.
And he's a great guy. And what a story he has. Learned how to read in prison, became a lawyer, and then fought his own case and realized they had given him double jeopardy. You know, or 3 strikes you're out.
Yeah.
That not double jeopardy, but 3 strikes you're out is supposed to be 3 separate instances of you being arrested for felonies.
Yes, you can't count one.
Exactly,
instance 3
and that's what
times.
they did to him, and
Yeah.
he successfully argued it and got released.
Yeah.
Which is amazing.
Yeah.
And now he gives motivational speeches, and he was actually a tennis player in Compton, a really good tennis player.
Oh wow.
Yeah, before he became like a big time drug dealer, but he was like a big time drug dealer. But he was illiterate. He never learned how to read until he went to jail, and learned how to read so that he could become a lawyer to defend himself.
That's amazing.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, it is.
But meanwhile, he was getting all that coke and selling all it because they were using him to make money so they could fund the Contras versus the Sandinistas.
Yeah, radically.
Which is nuts.
Radically
It's nuts.
Yeah.
Do
you play tennis, Joe?
No.
Never did?
I've played it a couple of times, but no, I'm not.
Yeah.
I'm not a tennis player.
Yeah.
Why do you play tennis?
Yeah. I do. I took it up. I was a basketball player in my youth, but there's a reason that you see people that look like me on tennis courts and not basketball courts. I just started to get hurt, right?
Yeah.
And that's what happens.
I think tennis
with
would get you hurt. There's a
basketball.
lot of the side movement.
Yeah, but it's not a contact sport. What happened with basketball is, you're in a small space. Everybody's body's getting wider. They're starting to wear these braces and big pieces of plastic, and inevitably you're just going to bang into somebody.
And you fall down and
and
twist
what's
ankles.
cool about tennis is it's not a contact sport, so you can just keep doing it. And I just, I was getting hurt. It wasn't as fun. And a basketball friend said to me, do you play tennis? And I said, well, not since I was 18, not really. And I went onto the court and I had the closest thing I'll ever have to a religious experience. The very first time I started hitting, and I was like, okay, done with basketball.
That was a religious experience, tennis?
It was. I mean, it was just because it was just so, it was just dramatic and rapid, right? It was just I realized it in one moment. But it turns out that it's also complicated. I mean, I'm sure any sport like martial arts is too. It becomes a head game as well. I think actually, based on what I've read about you, you would like it, because it turns out with tennis that unless you're very good, which I'm not and never will be, that almost every point is decided based on who concentrates more. It really is, and that's why, I mean, if you've ever gone to watch, somebody like, Nadal or Federer play.
No, I haven't.
What's amazing about it is not just their athleticism, because you can see that in any sport. What's amazing is that there are 19,000 people around them, and they are so locked in. It's just crazy, and that's really what it is. It's just staying in the point and thinking about nothing else.
This match is going a long time too, right?
They do, some of them to 5 hours.
5 hours.
Oh, some of the ones that are where it's best of 5 sets.
Do they take snacks?
Yeah. You can get little munchies, but
like
it's
bananas
not,
and stuff.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. Yeah. But it's really taught me a lot about how important focus is. I often say to my students, for me, that's the only really necessary condition for doing anything. I'm not a rocket scientist. I know what my limits are in that realm. What I can do, what I am able to do, is focus. And for me, that is just the absolute necessary condition for anything. And tennis really teaches you that, because, if I start thinking about my grocery list or a newspaper column that I'm writing, I'm fucked. And I'm not in the point anymore.
Sure, yeah.
And that's.
Yeah, I think there's a mental cleansing aspect of a lot of things, a lot of activities.
Oh.
I don't play golf, but it's been described to me that way.
Same deal.
And tennis, I'm sure. Archery, I do archery. That's one thing that's like that. The game of pool is like that. Like if
Yeah.
you're thinking about anything else while you're down there, you'll fuck up. And if
Yeah.
you just concentrate on only the game and keep playing it over and over again, it's like it clears your mind of problems.
It does.
In a weird way.
And yet, though, it can also be a source of them, because I've also discovered since I've taken up tennis that good begets good and bad begets bad. So, if you're really hitting it well, you can just keep going. But sometimes you're just in a rut and you can't get out. You know exactly what you're doing wrong and you can't stop yourself. And look, writing is like that too. But what I've discovered with writing is when you get to that like dark place, you just stop. Right? And if you come back to it and look at it with new eyes, you'll get out of it.
Right.
Tennis court, you can't do that. You just can't say, look, I keep fucking up my backhand. Let's just stop playing. Right? What you have to do is just keep fucking up your backhand, which is super frustrating. But and you can't, you know what you're doing and you can't stop it. And I guess that's just the nature of competition, because I think there are many things like that, like writing. But again, I've discovered that it's actually quite simple. Like sometimes you'll just be writing and every word looks terrible and you just don't have it going on. And if you just go outside or do something else and you come back to it, you will be able to do it better. But if you just sit there and keep trying to mull over it, everything will look like shit because you're just in that rut.
Well, there's some people that think that to concentrate on things, you're supposed to do things for a certain amount of time and take 5 minutes off on a regular basis.
Yeah.
That you should never just go all the way through. But then there's other schools of thought where you just keep drinking coffee and keep pounding on those keys.
Yeah, and I've done it both ways. It's very ineffable. I mean, the thing about writing is you sort of you kind of start to understand, if you've done it for a while, why the ancients all talked about like muses coming to them, right? If you read, Homer or anybody after that, and they talk about, people who are creating anything, a muse came to them.
Yeah.
It does feel that way sometimes. It's just, you're really inspired. You have a lot to say. You can say it. And then at other times, you're just pulling teeth, You have an idea, but you just can't find, like, the muse hasn't come to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But did you ever read Steven Pinker's work?
Oh, yeah.
Did you ever read The War of Art?
Yeah.
He's got a really interesting way of talking about the muse, that whether or not the muse is real, if you treat it like it's real and treat it with respect, then it'll keep providing you with creative gifts.
Right. I mean, the ancients understood that. I mean, they really got that right.
No, I'm sorry. Did I say Pinker? I meant Pressfield. Stephen Pressfield.
Yeah.
Did I say Pinker?
You did.
I think I did. Yeah, I meant Pressfield.
But I was thinking the same.
Yeah. That book, War of Art, I bought a stack of them, and I would hand them out to people, like when they would come on the podcast, just because it was and it's a small, easy read, but it's all about being a professional and this idea that if you just summon the muse and then show up at the same time every day with the intent to be creative, and you're going to put in the work, and you're not going to go watch YouTube videos or Google anything. You're going to really concentrate only on the writing itself, and that the muse will, whether or not it's a real thing, this idea that there's some angelic creative thing out there that bestows upon you creative gifts.
Right. But I think Pressfield's point is that it's useful to think of it in that way.
Yes.
Right? It gives you a certain kind of faith. Right?
Well, that's a lot of
really
people's
what it is.
perspective on religion. You know, that's Jordan Peterson's perspective on God, is that whether or not God exists or not, if you behave like God exists, you'll live a better life. And I'm like, there's some real wisdom in that, because there's something to it. If you really did behave as if some higher power was laid out the rules for a better, more harmonious world, and if you follow these rules, you'll have a better life. And that this is all, there's a logic to it and a law to it.
There is, and yet I know Peterson's Canadian, but in the United States, I think one of the most important social phenomena of the past 20 years is actually the decline in both, church, synagogue, mosque attendance, and also in the number of people that say they're affiliated with a faith.
Yeah.
By some measures, it's gone down 20%, which is radical.
Over how long?
20 years. Yeah. And I think, again, we're almost too close to that to really take its measure. I think the worst interpretation of it is that what we've done is we've substituted politics for religion.
Yeah.
We've made politics into a kind of faith system where it's not necessarily the blue and the red. They become a sort of religious identity, and we defend them in the same way.
I think there's some real truth to that.
And I think these things are probably at some level connected. Because I think lots of evolutionary psychologists have tried to make the claim that we are joiners. And that there is an evolutionary logic to faith systems, that they've helped us in all kinds of different ways. And we're always going to have some version of them, And I think the scariest part of now for me, is that our political affiliations have become quasi-religious.
I don't even think quasi.
Maybe flat out.
Pretty
religions.
much flat out and extremely tribal. And when you think about, if you just analyze the behavior of people on both extremes, whether it's the far left or the far right, they exhibit remarkably similar traits, like pure hatred for the other side, inability to look at the virtues of this opposing ideology, and almost like treating it as if the very nature of reality is at stake.
Yes, and I have a purchase on it, and you are blind.
Yes,
right.
Yes.
God did not shine on you.
Which is the Protestants versus the Catholics, in Ireland. I mean, it's really crazy.
Right.
That's what they did. When they were blowing each other up with the IRA.
I'm curious, Joe. Are you a religious believer?
I am not a non-believer. I'm not a believer. I don't go to church, but I would not be surprised if there's a lot more to this existence than we're experiencing in a way that you can measure.
Did you go to church as a kid?
Yeah, I went to Catholic school when I was a little kid. We went to church, but it was when my parents split up and when we went to San Francisco, all that stopped. I just never.
Was your stepdad a Catholic also, or
no.
just your mom?
He was when he was a kid as well, but they, it was the 70s. They were just hippies. But I think there's some real benefit to religion for a lot of people, and I didn't used to think that when I was younger. When I was younger, I was a lot more arrogant about it, and I thought it was for fools. I was like, oh yeah, a guy came back from the dead, and he used to walk on water, whatever, But now I look at it. And first of all, I understand what the Bible actually is now, and it's way more complicated. It's some people trying to make sense of the world thousands and thousands of years ago as interpreted through multiple languages back to English rather. And in a way that, there's a lot of these ancient languages, like if you go back to ancient Hebrew, letters doubled as numbers. So there was value in words. Right, like somebody told me once that the word love and the word God have the same numerical value. So if you combine the numbers and the letters, and it's like it wasn't as simple as when you get the interpretation to Latin or to Greek or to English. Ultimately, what you're not interpreting the full meaning in these sentences. That there's some intrinsic value that's lost because the ancient Hebrew version of it was like it just meant a different thing.
Right, and it's been transmuted through a million different histories, right? A million different peoples, right? And ideologies. And in all kinds of ways, right? I mean, heinous and wonderful. When my students tell me they don't like religion or they don't want to mix religion and politics, I'm always like, so we shouldn't have a Martin Luther King Day, right? I mean, what do we think he was? Right? What do we think the whole civil rights movement? Of course, But it's funny. I once asked a group of students what King's profession was, and I got hilarious answers. Like a lot of people thought he was a lawyer, but my favorite one of all was policy expert. It's like I have a dream that one day, thanks to the earned income tax credit, the poverty rate will decline 2%.
That's hilarious.
But again, I think that speaks to the kind of stigmatization of religion in certain circles in our country, especially elite circles, and this idea that it's this conservative principle or this backwards thing. And obviously, it's been used in those ways. But I mean, if you think about like movements for justice in this country, starting with abolitionism, right, going right straight through civil rights, they were all powered by religion.
Yeah, and it's empowering for so many communities to have this place where people go to worship because they've agreed upon certain kind of behavior when they go to these places, and in agreeing to work hard to be a better person and to tithe some of your earnings and there's all these different aspects of religion that I think really lends itself to empowering the bond that these people have with each other.
And what I find fascinating about it is that bond, that empowering, and also that identity. They can work even if you don't believe in God or even think about Him.
Yes.
I mean, and I feel I'm an example of that. I mean, I'm Jewish, and being Jewish is hugely important to me, the way I see the world, the way I think. But at the same time, I'm not a believer, I don't think. I don't walk around wondering if there's a God, and I rarely go to synagogue.
Would you be surprised if there was a God?
No. I wouldn't be surprised if there wasn't. I mean, I'll be honest, I just don't give it a lot of thought. What I care about is the world as I can see it, the world as I can know it.
Right.
For me, what's really important about Judaism is the charge that it gives you to try to change that world. I know this isn't everybody's interpretation of Judaism, but it's mine. So at Passover, what do you say? You say, remember that you were a slave in Egypt. Right? And so that experience of being a pariah, which has been so central to the Jewish experience, what that does is that enjoins you to ask, okay, who's the pariah now? Right? It might not be you now,
right?
But it's going to be somebody else. Right? And
those
your job as a Jew, whoever it is, your job as a Jew is to seek them out, reach out to them, try to understand them. My archaeologist friends have told me that, speaking of Passover, there's actually no real archaeological evidence that Jews were enslaved en masse in Egypt, like that there was a mass population transfer. Like, I grew up thinking that actually happened. Okay, the stuff with the parting of the Red Sea, okay, there you get into the faith realm. But I thought as a matter of history, right, that had happened. Apparently we don't have evidence for it. But so what? Right? Does that take anything away from the Exodus story? For me, it actually doesn't. I don't feel that I need any proof on this score.
Doesn't history get real shaky, though, when they're going back to ancient Egypt?
Of course it does. You have to look at shards of pottery, and you have to look at other things. And apparently they found there was some trade, as you might guess, because there were so many different populations that are both in conflict and in movement and all that, right? Mm-hmm. But I remember somebody told me the Jews built the pyramids. This is not true.
I read that
right?
too.
Yeah. But again, so what? There's still, even if that quote didn't happen and the Red Sea didn't part, to me, just the historic experience that Jews have had, and especially their experience as being the pariah, as being the outgroup, and fighting back against that, and asserting themselves, that's what I take away from it. And especially my duty as a Jew to try to make things a little less fucked up, especially for whoever is a slave now. And by the way, I'm not saying that's how other Jews see it or should, but for me, it's an example of the power of religion. And it's got nothing to do with God.
Right.
Not to me.
Yeah, it's guidelines for how to live
guidelines,
moral life.
Guidelines, impulses, perspectives, all that stuff.
Yeah.
And I think, we need that. We need those organizing principles as human beings.
I think we definitely do, and I think we definitely do benefit from that community gathering place where people agree to worship together. Because if you, even, again, like Pressfield called upon the muse, even if the muse isn't real, if you treat it like it's real, and if you have a place where everybody gets together and they all agree, we're going to be better people because of the Lord, and the Lord watches us, and the Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away, and just think about all the real positive aspects of some of the religious tenets.
Right. And I also think that in part because we're secularizing, there's perhaps less awareness of all that. And perhaps we should be a little bit more concerned, about the fact that fewer people are affiliated with a religion. Again, I don't know what we can necessarily do about that. But there's also a lot of prejudice about it. There's no question, right? I mean, think of, the play, The Book of Mormon, which, by the
Right.
way, I think is brilliant.
Brilliant.
All right? But
Love
what
it.
if there was on Broadway the Book of the Quran or the Book of the Talmud? Like, can you imagine the shitstorm there would be, right?
It's true.
You know, and everybody would be like, oh, I can't believe you're making fun of this world religion. But with the Book of the Mormons, we're like, ha, ha, ha. You know,
Well,
Book
first
of
of
Mormon.
all, one thing, Mormons have a great sense of humor.
Yes.
They can take it. They take a joke really well. Second, there's a thing when you know the guy who made the religion. It's a different thing. You know, it's like one thing, like Judaism, you're talking about thousands of years of history.
Yeah.
Islam, more than 1,000 years of history, right?
Right. I mean, that's what's fascinating about the LDS story is it's just quintessentially
Yeah.
American.
Right, exactly.
Right? You know, it's a frontier story, right? You know, and
a 14-year-old bullshit artist. That's what it's about. A 14-year-old bullshit artist tricked a lot of people, and they kind of know it.
Right. But at the same time, I mean, the historic ironies are so great because, you know, Republican Mormons in Utah, they're like the most Republican people on earth.
Yeah.
And yet, of course, the Republican Party pursued Brigham Young all the way into the Great Salt Basin. I mean, you think that's really where they wanted to go? You think they're like, oh, this seems like a really habitable place. Like, let's live in the Great
This
Salt
fucking
Basin.
dead lake.
Exactly.
There's some
That was
shrimp
basic-
in that lake, and that's
that
it.
was as far as the Army, which was led by the Republican Party, was willing to pursue them. You know, the line was that the Mormons, it wasn't just, of course, that they were, they were bigamists or Satanists or whatever. You know, they oppressed women. Like slavery oppressed African Americans. I mean, that was one of
Yeah.
the arguments. You know, and the Mormons aren't dumb. Once they create a territory, of course, they enfranchise women before anybody. And they're
Right.
like, oh, we're the people? Like, we're the people that oppress women? Like, did they vote back in Massachusetts? Huh, they don't. That's pretty interesting. You know, I mean, back to the Book of the Mormon, I mean, what I think is fascinating, how the LDS, you know, establishment handled that. What they did, which I thought was super smart, was they're like, let's not beat them, let's join them. So you go to Broadway and you get your little playbill, and I'm sure you've seen this, like on the second page, there's an ad from
Yeah.
the Mormon Church from
Yep.
LDS, and they're
Yep.
like, okay,
Full page
you've
ad.
you've seen the play. Now look at the real thing.
I bet they got a lot of people to join, too,
Yeah.
because of that. Didn't
Super
Glenn Beck
smart.
join the Mormons, like, deep into
Yes.
his 40s? Here's
Yeah.
the thing about Mormons. I've known quite a few of them, and they're some of the nicest fucking people.
Yes.
And I don't know why. I don't know what they're doing, but they are so friendly and so nice.
Well, look, one of the reasons, there are many, but one is that, you know, they have this tradition of mission, right?
Yes.
And so, at least on the male side, like,
Service.
right, you have to become an elder.
Mm-hmm.
You have to go off and evangelize, and that's not going to work very well if you're a dick. Right? It really isn't. I mean, I have an old friend and colleague who's a Mormon, and he's not a believer anymore, but he served in Italy. And he told me that doing that was the key to everything he's done ever since, because he said, John, if you can sell that, you can do anything, man.
That's interesting.
Right? But it's also not going to work if you're a dick. Or
Right.
like if you're walking around in jeans and a hoodie, right? I mean, the Mormons, they do
Right.
it right. You know, it's
Wear a
like
tie.
we've all seen them, right?
Yep.
You know, and you know, you've got to you have to be aware. And you have to understand your surroundings and how they're different from what you expect. I mean, it's funny, we mentioned the Peace Corps. My father was a Peace Corps director in both Iran and India. And he once showed me this memo that he sent to Washington just saying, send me more Mormons. Because he said every single Mormon volunteer was fantastic. And the big reason was they had already had that third culture experience, right? They had gone off to, you know, Argentina or Italy or wherever to do the mission. So they had like lived in a place where they were weird and had to learn the language and all that stuff. So they were great volunteers.
Wow.
Yeah.
The craziest story about the Mormon is the Mormons' expansion into Mexico.
Yes.
And then the fact that there's still these families that have these compounds down in Mexico.
Oh, and there was that awful episode a
Yes.
couple years ago
Yeah,
where
with
some of
the
them were
cartel
murdered.
members. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. The Mexico story is, and the Romney family. I mean, you know,
Yes.
they had branches down there and all that. Yeah.
It's so crazy. Like back
Yeah.
when it didn't matter if you lived in Mexico or the United States because everybody was on horseback, they were
Right.
like, listen, we'll just go down here
Yeah.
where we can have 50 wives.
I mean, the other thing for
Let's
those of us,
party.
for those of us who are Jews, another sort of interesting aspect of the whole Mormon story is the Mormons tend to be philo-Semites. They love us, man. They love Jews. So the first Jewish governor in the United States, his name is Bamberger, and he's the governor of Utah. And it was the inheritor of kind of the Bamberger, I think it was department stores.
You know
right?
about the guy who spent all the money to sequence the genome of Native Americans because he wanted to find out if they were the lost tribe of Israel, because that's in the Book of Mormon? Do you know that?
Yeah. And look, it's a lot of it is bizarre, but it's also fascinating, right?
Yeah.
And it's funny on the Jewish Mormon thing. I mean, the other controversy that's come up in the past couple of years, you know how the Mormons can sort of make anybody Mormon, like including well after they're dead.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And so at one point, a couple of years ago, they declared that Anne Frank, the Holocaust victim, was a Mormon. And look, each to their own. I mean, I can understand why plenty of my fellow Jews were offended by that. My view was, if that's what some Mormon dude wants to think, they can think it.
Well, they
It's
think
not
they
gonna-
get their own planet when they die.
Yeah. There's the whole eschatology, like the whole system, is totally fascinating, and and you can again, like Anne Frank, you can sort of graduate people into it.
Weird.
Yeah, but again, it's like.
Listen,
What
it
if?
works for a lot of them, and they're very nice people, but it does leave them vulnerable. I have a friend, and she left the Mormon church as an adult, and she found herself very susceptible to sort of like healers and yogi type people, and she goes, I think what it is I was so accustomed to just believing in things that didn't necessarily make sense, but allowing them to like, oh, okay, and that
Yes.
she's so gullible. But it was interesting, like seeing her as an adult, trying
Right.
to make sense of it as to what it was that was leading her to be so susceptible.
Yes, and I think for the Mormons, especially as you were saying, because it's so American and so new, I think there are a lot of tensions between, let's just say, the believers and the historians, right? Because, once you start studying history of anything, it gets complicated, and it's not like what you thought. And, the Mormons were involved in, we think, several massacres of other human beings, including this place called Mountain Meadows. And it's been very hard for people in the Mormon church, for some of the believers, to accept that. So there's always going to be a tension between faith and history.
Yeah.
There almost has to be, I think.
Yeah, well, the thing about history, particularly like history before photographs, is there's a lot of fuckery. Like, who knows? History's written by the winners.
There's ambiguity,
Oh,
but
man.
but at the same time, there's just there's conquest. I mean, that's what history is.
Right.
I mean, we went to Iceland a couple of years ago, our family, and somebody there told us that, as best we can tell, Iceland is the only place that was never colonized, in the sense that when the Vikings got there was literally no one there. And then, by the way, after that, it became like a whole Game of Thrones shit, which is why Game of Thrones is filmed there. I mean, there was a million conquerors after that, But when the first Vikings came there was nobody there. And apparently that's sui generis, like that's its own animal. So think about that.
Wow.
Every other place that people move to, there are other human beings there, right?
Yeah.
And, that means they clash.
Right.
Right. It's not the only thing they do. They also mix, right? But they clash. And one team dominates the other one in some way. That is the story of history, And so once you start digging, right, you find that nobody's hands are clean, right? Everyone was involved in some kind of act of conquest or domination, almost. Right? So, one of the things that we now do in many elite campuses is, at the beginning of any event, we'll say, now let's remember that we're on Lenape land, right? Or Choctaw land. You've probably heard these sort of new Native American affirmations. And look, I'm a historian. I think it's great that people learn more about the Lenapes or the Choctaws. But I'm also a little bit troubled by this ritual, because it does seem to imply that, like, the Lenapes were just there from time immemorial, living in some Edenic place, instead of like conquering whoever it was that was there before the Lenapes.
Right.
And of course, that's the native story.
Yep.
Right? They
Yeah.
conquered each other. Right? They made tribes. They made empires. Right? One team ruled, sometimes killed the other. And again, that's not. I think there should be much more awareness, right, of Native American history, and I think those affirmations are fine, but it'd also be useful for us to think about, again, who was there before that team,
Yeah.
right? And, those people were conquered, right? They were victims, but they were also at some point conquerors, and almost everybody was.
Look, the world was a savage place back then.
Yes, it was.
It's just how people stayed alive. You encountered strangers, you killed them.
Yeah.
I mean, when was it that when a boat showed up on your shores, it was a good thing?
Yeah.
I mean, when did that start?
I think much more recently than most of us appreciate.
For most of human history, when people just randomly showed up in a boat, it was a dangerous time.
Definitely.
They might be just there to trade, or they might be there to rape and pillage.
Yes, conquer you, right? Yeah. Enslave you.
Yeah.
Right. Put you to work for their project.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, there's no telling.
Yeah.
You had to guess.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, it's I'm fascinated by Native American history, and I'm fascinated by how long they must have been living here in that manner before white people showed up, and then white people show up, and within a few years, everyone's dead.
And obviously
90%.
disease is the big reason for that.
Yeah.
I think some people imagine that, everyone died in wars, and actually many more people died of disease.
90% died from disease.
Yeah.
I mean, there were certainly a lot of murders, but they just had no, and that was, I'm listening to this book on tape about Cortez and a lot of the Spanish explorers making it to Native America, or North America rather. And one of the things they talk about is the Mayan Empire.
Yeah.
They have this detailed account of Mayans. And I was thinking, oh, well, they probably died off from disease too. I mean, that's probably what killed off the Mayan Empire, because they don't really know. They're really not sure what happened to the Mayans. But if the Spaniards are describing their encounters with the Maya, for sure they gave them diseases.
Yeah.
Right? They fucking killed everybody else.
Yeah.
I mean, their disease just swept through the Native Americans, and there was millions and millions and millions of them all across the country. Imagine this one, like Chichen Itza. Imagine this one small area with this incredible civilization that had evolved over who knows how long, built these amazing structures, and then gone.
Right.
The whole civilization abandoned.
Right.
No one there.
Right.
Disease, right?
Yeah.
Most likely.
I think that was a big part of it.
Has to be.
And I mean, to the earlier point, I mean, the conquistadors did horrific things in that part of the world, right? But of course, the people in that part of the world did not horrific things to other people well before the conquistadors got there. I mean, there were forms of human sacrifice in that part of the world.
Well, how about what was the temple that they built? I never can pronounce this correctly, but there was a temple an Aztec temple that they built, where at the completion of it, they had a ritual sacrifice where they killed something like 80,000 slaves.
Yeah.
What a I don't remember how to say it. Teotihuacan, how do you say it?
Yeah, it begins with a T.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Say that. Tenochtitlan.
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's in Mexico City.
Does it say how to say it? No, I don't know. They don't say how to. They don't have a pronunciation. Yes. Well, when it was there for 695 years. Wow.
Yeah.
So when they finished it, when they completed it, they killed everybody. Like they did it over a weekend.
Right.
Just a fucking full-on slaughter fest. What is the number? Does it say the number of people that were sacrificed? Because it's something insane. Where I told a friend of mine, he was like, that can't be true. I'm like, let's read it.
Yeah.
And he's like, holy shit.
Right.
Like, how long did that take? Because they're doing it with swords.
Yeah.
So they're killing 80,000 people with swords.
And it's, I mean, this is where things
Might not
get...
be 80,000 people. It's something nutty like that.
This is where things get interesting and complicated and political, right? I mean, look, the story that we told for most of our history in this country was that colonialism was a beneficent thing, right? That was developed to basically civilize savages, right? And that was flawed in a million different ways, and it's great that we've corrected it.
Yeah.
But, right, again, we shouldn't congratulate ourselves too quickly or imagine that we've got it right when we just reverse things and say, oh, Columbus and everybody came after them were just, horrible, evil enslavers, and everybody that they encountered was some sort of innocent victim.
Right.
That actually patronizes the people they encountered, I think, who had their own complex societies with their own divisions and, yes, often their own brutalities. But there's a politics to all of this.
There seems to be no historically utopian civilization that we can call upon and say this group got it right. right?
Yeah.
It doesn't seem like there is.
Right, except the Pacific Heights neighborhood of San Francisco.
Ah.
Yeah.
Well, you see what it is? It's like all tribes and all civilizations are made out of people. That's the problem.
With warts and all.
Yeah. Humans. Humans are
Right.
weirdly flawed, messy creatures.
Yeah. And look, thank God for that, right?
Yeah.
That's what keeps things interesting.
Yes. Well, for
Right.
us humans.
Yeah.
But once we become these Neuralink things, what does it say here? 84,000 people were slaughtered in 4 days.
Yeah.
So long weekend.
Ouch.
84,000 fucking people. That is so crazy. That is
Yeah.
so crazy.
Yeah.
So
And so we should be able to find a way to critique what the conquistadors did and the way they overran these societies without nostalgizing or romanticizing what their societies were.
So it's not just slaves. Here it says, defeated soldiers were not killed on the battlefield, but captured and returned to Tenochtitlan for sacrifice. The Aztec raiders were convinced that the end of the world was nigh and butchered thousands to appease the gods. This was a culture obsessed with death. They believed that human sacrifice was the highest form of karmic healing. When the Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan was consecrated, and I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong because I probably am, was consecrated in 1487, the Aztecs recorded that 84,000 people were slaughtered in 4 days.
Yeah.
Wow. Jesus. How'd they keep those people standing still?
Yeah, God.
84,000. After a while, you think that guy's tired. When he picks that sword up, I'm going to jack him. Like, there's no way he's going to be able to kill 40,000 people in a day. He has to be so tired.
1,000 people every hour with a 3-hour break to take
An hour. 1,000 people an hour is so many people.
Right, and look, here's...
But
right.
there's 60 seconds in a minute.
Yeah. I
There's
was trying to
60
break it
minutes in
down
an hour.
further.
How many fucking people you have to kill 1,000 an hour? That's all.
It's fast. It's a lot of arrows.
I don't think they're using arrows,
I
dude.
know. I was
Yeah.
thinking of your thing from yesterday. Your Kong.
I think they just did it with swords. But it's like, that's one fascinating thing, too, about ancient civilizations. How many of them were obsessed with human ritual sacrifice to appease gods because they were so terrified of dying that they felt like maybe if we just killed this guy,
Right.
like maybe we'll keep living.
Yeah.
Like the gods will smile upon us.
Yeah. Or like the Egyptians, they just imagined that there was a way for them to be immortal, right?
yeah.
To live in some tomb or some other thing, What's interesting about the Greeks is that they didn't, right? And that's why they revered the gods. The gods were imperfect too, right? And they had little jealousies and spats. But here's what was not human about them. They lived forever, right?
Yes.
And the Greeks understood like our own greatest imperfection is in fact our mortality. And what differentiated the gods wasn't, that they threw thunderbolts or anything. Really what differentiated them was that, they just went on and we don't. Yeah.
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 Have you ever heard of Brian Murarescu? He's a scholar and an author of a book called The Immortality Key. And he came on this podcast and explained his work that has now become it's now a point of study at Harvard. And what it is he explored the history of the ritualized use of psychedelic drugs in ancient Greece.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. How do you say it? Elicited. How do you say elicit? How do you say that word? The mysteries. What is that word?
The Elysian Field thing?
No.
I didn't think so,
The
but
Eleusis, right? Eleusinian mysteries. Is that how you say it?
Yeah, I don't know.
They had these rituals, these ancient rituals in Greece that all of these scholars would go and participate in, and they wrote about them in these very romantic ways, and people were trying to figure out what the hell how do you say it? Eleusinian. That's it. So I did say it right.
Yeah.
So this right here, it says this the sanctuary in ancient Greece, the most famous of the secret religious rites of ancient Greece, and he proved by not just examining the contents of these, a lot of their wine and their beer had been laced with psychedelics. And so
from mushrooms?
From different things, and many of them from ergot, so different forms, which is very similar to LSD.
Yeah.
So they would add this stuff to their wine, and then they would have these incredible ceremonial rituals. And during these ceremonies, they would learn things. And then they were discouraged from doing these things by the Roman emperor. And so they would then move their ceremonies. He found them, what was it, in Spain, I think? I forget, but he tracked the exact same ritualistic and the same depictions of gods and the same pottery with the same psychedelic laced compounds that you could get. They could get evidence of it, and the molecules are still intact. Yeah, amazing stuff.
I wonder if like Sophocles was tripping when he wrote his plays. I mean, that would explain Oedipus.
It would explain a lot of things. But just the fact that ancient Greece was, it was the original source of democracy, right? The original source of so much information that if you go to all the ancient wise people that we respect and revere, how many of them participated in this ritual in ancient Greece? And it's really interesting because it was such a hub of thought.
Yes.
Right? And such a hub of innovation in terms of like societal structure and the way we treated people.
Oh, and I mean, obviously, one of the ways that they maintained democracy was by enslaving certain people to do the shit work, right? Which was a model, actually, that people like Jefferson invoked, quite literally. Mm-hmm. They said this is how the Greeks were able to make democracy, is they solved the problem of who's going to do the shit work.
Jesus.
Yeah.
That's what's so dark, is that people have this ability to dehumanize other people.
Yes, they do.
And make people, like you were talking about in Nepal, the structure where the shoemaker is the lowest form and a literal untouchable.
Yeah.
Like you're not allowed to touch them.
But look,
but
that's not shoes. It's not so foreign to us. Like what's a whites only water fountain except for that?
Right.
Right? Well, and I think sometimes we forget just how close we are chronologically to that.
Yes.
My parents lived in the South for 2 years when my dad was doing his military service in the late 50s, and it was all that. Mm-hmm. And my brother was born, when all that was happening. Mm-hmm. And I went to the March on Washington in my stroller.
Whoa.
Yeah. There's a picture somewhere of me in my stroller. I was sleeping, but my parents went to the March on Washington. That's pretty wild. And you can tell it's the March on Washington. because there's just there's a look to the March on Washington.
Dude, you've been progressive from the womb.
Exactly.
Like you got OG street cred in the progressive world.
But actually, Joe, I don't. That's one of the reasons I wrote this book is, of course, you're right. I'm a liberal Democrat, but I see free speech as central to that. Mm. And the real problem for me on campuses now is that free speech has been coded as conservative. So you're right, it is in my blood. And, come on. I was in the Peace Corps. I'm Jewish. I have a PhD. I'm like a cartoon of a liberal Democrat. And if you went on to Americans for Democratic Action and you took their little tests about what's a Democrat, pro-gun control, anti-capital punishment, right down the line, each and every one, except I'm a zealot about free speech. And for a whole variety of unfortunate political reasons, that's now been coded as conservative. So at the place I work, there are a lot of people, generally people that don't know me, they've just read things by me, that think I'm a Republican.
Wow.
And it just cracks me up because, why else would you be mouthing off about free speech? Because that's a very conservative idea. That basically lets white people engage in hate speech that hurts minorities.
Isn't that crazy?
It is crazy, but that's where we are.
Imagine pigeonholing free speech into that definition.
Well, that's the reason that Signe Wilkinson, the cartoonist, and I wrote the book, is we wanted to look backwards to remind really our younger readers that, Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony and Martin Luther King, they were all free speech zealots.
Yeah.
They had to be.
Why do you think it's what we were talking about at the very beginning of this conversation, that it's more convenient and there's such a temptation to just silence people that you disagree with, that they've ignored the reality of discourse, and that it's so important to work out who's right, and it actually strengthens your position on things. It doesn't harm your position, and it actually brings more people to your side than it does push them away.
Yeah, it does. Bullying people is not a good way to convince them. You can bring them to heel, right? And you can get them to say certain words like mantras.
Right.
But if you want to persuade them, bullying is not a good system.
No.
But it's interesting. You mentioned discourse, and we want to stamp out things that we think are harmful. I mean, I think that's something else really important that's changed. I think maybe in the past 2 decades is, what I call a kind of psychologizing of politics, whereby if you say something I disagree with, it's not just that I disagree with it or I think it's wrong for the following reasons. It's that you harm me.
Yes.
You microaggressed me.
Right.
You triggered me. You hurt my soul.
Your speech is violence.
Exactly. And I think that's of relatively recent vintage. And just like lots of things, I think it has complicated origins and not entirely bad ones. I think part of it comes from greater awareness of mental health, which I think is overall a plus.
Right.
But I would argue that this is a place where it's been a minus. That is, the application of the psychological frame to these discussions has ultimately led us to a whole bunch of cul-de-sacs. I often say to my students, look, if you're microaggressed by something I say in class, you tell me you are. I basically have one thing to say in response. I'm sorry. Like, I didn't want to offend you, but I wouldn't have anything else to say. I wouldn't say you weren't offended, because I don't know that. And I wouldn't say you weren't harmed, because I can't look into your soul to say that.
I think I would just simply say it's not my intention.
Right.
But this is a lazy way to communicate.
Well,
because you're always a victim, and you're always looking to call people out for this and for that. And it's like,
and also, I think, unfortunately, all this rhetoric feeds on itself, and it teaches people to feel a certain way.
Yeah.
Right? It teaches people to feel certain harm. And look, I'm not a sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt me guy. I think words do hurt, right? But once you make hurt the barometer of what you're going to say and not say, or allow and not allow, I mean, forget it.
There's also
right?
intent, and words are supposed to convey intent. And one of the problems is when you make more and more words, magic words that you can't say, you do 2 things. One, you limit discourse, because then you have less words that you're allowed to use to form your sentence. And the English language is so nuanced. Words can mean multiple things.
Yeah.
And then 2, you're doing that, and you're empowering those words that you can't use. So now when someone uses those words, like, Jesus, did he say that? You know? And the more we add to that pile, the more it gives people that are trying to hurt you weapons.
Right.
They have more rocks on their side now.
And it adds to the stigma, right?
Yeah.
And it adds to the sense of fear.
Lenny Bruce did a bit about that in the 1960s, remember?
And he'd go like, N-word, N-word, N-word,
Yeah.
and then he'd say the S-word, and he'd say all these other things, and he'd say, look, if we just keep doing that enough, then the end of the riff was, he said, like, no little black kid will come home crying from school because a white boy called him the N-word.
Yes.
I mean, that was sort of his takeaway.
Yes.
Like, is we have to try to just kind of deprive these words of their hurt, of their power. And look, there are examples of that in recent history. I mean, think about the term queer.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Right.
I mean, when I was a kid, queer was one of the worst things that you could call somebody, right? And now there are queer studies departments in American universities, right?
Right.
Because the Lenny Bruce thing kind of worked.
Yeah.
Right? You kept saying queer, 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 and you gave it a different set of associations, and you defanged it.
Right.
Right?
That is interesting. That's a good example of a word that's evolved and become an acceptable word. Not only that, but like preferred.
Yeah.
And sometimes doesn't even mean gay, right? Like that's where it gets real slippery. It doesn't mean necessarily gay. It means like, I'm whatever. I'm queer. It's weird.
Right. And look, that's good too. I mean, it's good. I think ambiguity is good. I think we get into our worst places when, again, we're too certain.
Too binary.
Right? And yes, it's going to mean different things to different people. It's changing over time. It meant something very different when I was a high school kid than it does today. And that's the good stuff, I think. I mean, for
we just
me,
need to read each other's minds.
Get back to that little Elon Musk thing we're going to insert.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what's going to get us out of this little game we're playing with language. Because if people are doing that, they're looking to be offended. They're trying hard to be offended, trying to play a game instead of trying to just rationally communicate with you. Instead of like trying to find out how you think and expressing themselves in a very polite and maybe even a gentle way, right? Instead of doing that, you're playing a game where you're trying to be offended, looking to keep someone on the defensive. It's annoying. It's an annoying way to communicate, and it becomes much like tennis is a game. It becomes a game, right? And it becomes a game that people play verbally.
Right. And a cul-de-sac is really what it is, I think, in the sense that it interrupts discussion. You know, when I give this rap to my students about how problematic this whole like psychological frame is, they'll often say like, "You're denying our feelings." And I say, no, it's the opposite, actually. I would never deny your feelings, and it's precisely the undeniability of your feelings that makes this such a poor venue for discussion. Like, I can't tell you how you're feeling or how you should feel, right? But what I can tell you is that when your feeling becomes a trump card, right, we're not going to be able to communicate anymore.
Right.
You know, because, you know, words do offend. They do, right? And, you know, I don't go out of my way to offend people, but I know that because I'm a journalist and a historian, right, that sometimes I'm going to write or say things that will offend people. I think that comes with the territory, you know, and I think if what we decide is that we're never going to offend each other, we're actually never going to learn from each other.
Well, especially when you're dealing with people that have this broad range of sensitivities. Like what would offend one person would never offend you, and what would offend me would probably be like horrendous to someone else. Like,
And look, you know, I mean, there's a story that begins our little book that is right on point involving Mary Beth Tinker, who was the 13-year-old who wore the armband to Warren Harding Middle School in Des Moines in 1965.
Armband?
Yeah, a black armband to protest the Vietnam War.
Oh.
And she was sent home, and that later became the court case Tinker v. Des Moines, in which the Supreme Court said that neither students nor teachers shed their free expression rights at the schoolhouse gate. So she's a great symbol of, there she is.
Look at her there.
Yeah,
Wow.
with her black armband. Well, Mary Beth Tinker isn't that much older than I am. And
you ever hang out with her?
He's a good friend, actually.
Oh, it's a he now.
No, she.
I thought you said he's a good friend.
No.
Oh.
Just a terrific,
you never know.
a terrific person.
Those, did they have
there she
peace
is.
signs? That's her.
Yeah. Anyway, she's become a friend, and she came up to my class at Penn. And she did her presentation. By the way, she still has the armband, and she like puts it on students. And of course, I'm a historian. I'm like, shouldn't that be in the National Archives? Like,
right, the
like
same
you're just
armband?
carrying it around. Like, do you also have a copy of the Declaration of Independence in your purse? You know,
Right.
But it's great, actually. I mean, it's a great teaching tool. And Mary Beth is absolutely fabulous. So she tells her story about getting sent home, and eventually getting the ACLU to represent her, and becoming what she is, which is this kind of great symbol and also voice for free speech. And the students take it in and they say, look, Ms. Tinker, you were fighting the good fight, right? You were fighting the war in Vietnam. This Milo Yiannopoulos clown, like this Ann Coulter jokester, like this Ben Shapiro hoaxer, they just hurt people. Why should we allow them to speak? And she had a very, I think, important and pointed response. She said, listen, at my middle school, there were kids who had fathers and brothers and uncles. They were fighting, and some of them dying in Southeast Asia. You don't think they were hurt by this snot-nosed kid wearing this symbol saying that their loved one was risking their life for a lie? Like, you don't think that hurt them? Like, if that's what you think, like, you're not thinking. Like, of course it hurt them. So once that becomes like your barometer, your measure of what's going to be allowed as speech, forget Mary Beth Tinker, forget anything, because words do hurt, right? That in part was the point, right? That was the point of the symbol, right? Again, I'm not saying that Mary Beth intended to hurt anybody, because I can assure you that she didn't. But what I'm saying is it effectively hurt people. Right? Because speech, especially challenging speech, does. And the students they took this in and they said, look, free speech, it's just about who has power and who doesn't. And the people with power, they love to talk about free speech because they've got power. And Mary Beth Tinker is like, hold on, wait a minute. I was a 13-year-old girl. Speech was the only power I had. And that's really our point here, right? Is that, when you start to restrict it in whatever way, formally and informally, right? Even with the best of intentions, it's people without power ultimately that are going to suffer. It's people at the bottom that are going to get hurt, right? Because they need speech more than anybody else. Before the 1960s, students had no speech rights that the courts or the Constitution was willing to recognize. So, if a student said something in school that the teacher didn't like, they could just send them home, And it's because of Mary Beth Tinker and the other kids who protested that now it's not like that. Right? And of course, we can debate the degree to which this should be allowed, and should you be able to wear a Confederate flag on your T-shirt or, an anti-abortion symbol. And these are all important things to talk about. But even the reason we're talking about them is because Mary Beth Tinker, who was 13, who had no power other than her speech, stood up for her speech. Even though, yes, it hurt people, right? Because speech does that. But at the end of the day, that's really the message that I want our young people to get, right? Is that the real reason I think we need to hold on to free speech is we live in an unequal society like all societies are. And we live in a society with all sorts of unfairness, all sorts of injustice like all societies have, all right? And if you want to do anything about that, you got to let everyone talk. That's the only way to make anything better, to right anything wrong, to right any wrong, is to maintain our free speech.
Have you ever had a debate with someone who believes that deplatforming is a valid way to...
All the time.
What do they say?
Well, look, again, I think with the best of intentions, I don't like to question people's motives. And I think the people on the deplatforming side, I think they believe what they believe for good reasons, right? They want to protect certain populations at the school, especially minorities, from some pretty offensive and awful speech, And I understand that. And I respect it to a degree. That is, I respect their goal. But, where to start? Who's going to be so offensive that our minority students can't hear him or her? Who's going to make that call? B, are you sure the minority students are going to be offended? How do you know that? C, aren't you condescending to them just a little if you assume that they can't handle this? All right? And D, even if it is offensive to them, how do you know they'll benefit by being insulated from it? Can we find a cognitive psychologist or, anybody who does behavior therapy to tell us that the way to help somebody who is afraid or threatened by something is to insulate them from it? That's not how it works. That makes things worse. So, I know I'm throwing out a lot there, but I think there are many different objections to this. And again, I want to be totally clear, I'm not questioning that the deplatforming people want to help. I'm just questioning whether they do.
When I was in high school, Barney Frank came to our school and debated some conservative guy with an American flag on his lapel. And I think I was probably 14 or 15 years old. And they brought us into this auditorium. And Barney Frank just demolished this guy. He was so much more clever and interesting and, just made really good points. And it was cool to watch, because I got to see one guy's perspective that seemed to me to be, what's a good way to put it? It seemed like he was bullshitting, but he was bullshitting in a weird, he was pretending the world is different than it is, and he was going to trick us kids into in this way of saying it that was very almost Hollywood movie-esque. And Barney Frank just dismantled him. And I remember sitting there going, wow, this is interesting. Listening to these, this guy had his chance, and then this guy has his chance. And This guy's got better, more well-formed thoughts. He's more articulate. He's more clever. And I like that guy better. And it's that's what you need to see. And this idea that everything needs to be an echo chamber is fucking crazy. Because then you leave out the possibility of these moments where someone does get dismantled. And this is what we said earlier. The answer to bad speech is not deplatforming. It's better speech. So
Right.
you don't need to take a guy like Milo out of the ecosphere. You need to have someone debate him who's fucking good. You know, and you got to go, hey, man, we got a heavy hitter on this side. We got to bring somebody in that really knows their shit.
Yeah.
You know, I mean,
Yeah.
Ben Shapiro has made a career of trouncing people that were not as verbally skilled as him. If you
Yes.
go and look at his Instagram or his YouTube page, he's fantastic at pointing out logical fallacies and a lot of these like really simple utopian ideas that a lot of these kids bring to him. And he points it out, and he's got a very fast way of talking, and you can't compete with him. He's very articulate. And when he does that, these kids just get battered. I mean, there's like dozens and dozens of videos of him doing that.
And look, back to Milo and even Ben Shapiro, I mean, you also give these people a lot more power and oxygen when you try to shut them down. And that's, I think, another theme in the history of free speech and censorship, right?
Yes.
One of the great ways to give somebody a bigger microphone is to try to take it away.
Well, it's
and
also...
we've seen this over and over again. I mean, the anti-slavery movement is a great example of that. I mean, there were gag rules in Congress, like trying to prevent people from bringing in petitions that were anti-slavery petitions. And John Quincy Adams became this huge national hero, by the way, after he was president, right? When he was in Congress, and he was like our most distinguished ex-president ever. He was sort of the leading abolitionist in Congress, precisely because he violated the gag rule.
Wow.
Right? You know, because the gag rule actually gave him more oxygen. The goal of the gag rule, as per the name, was to gag Adams. It had the opposite effect. And censorship almost always does.
It's also, there's so much censorship that's just so disingenuous. Like the reasoning behind it. Like one of the things about Shapiro is they always call him alt-right. Like, no, he's not. Like, not even remotely. He's just conservative. He just happens to be a conservative Jew. And if you look into it, he was one of the years when he was when he was becoming famous, he was the biggest target for anti-Semitic hate online. The biggest.
Yeah.
And like he can point to like actual statistics of social media and show you the numbers. He's not alt-right. You know? He's conservative, and you can't. If you don't agree with him, there's nothing wrong with disagreeing with him. But you form a good argument.
Right.
Form a good argument. The guy's a master speaker. He's very good at speaking. So get a master speaker on the left, and let's do the Barney Frank thing. Like duke it out with him in the court of public opinion, and let's see what's up.
And also, don't try to muzzle him because eventually. A, it won't work, and B, don't have so much hubris, right? That's going to be used against you, like it has been and it will be. Well, look,
it goes further and further left. What's actually considered hate speech? It gets, once you get rid of all the real crazy psychos, right? Then you start moving into like more conservative but like very reasonable people, and like fuck them. And then next thing you know,
it is a moving target. And look, this is why the history piece is important too. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned Barney Frank. I assume he was your representative at the time because you lived in Newton, right?
I think he was. I was.
Yeah,
a
he could have been
14-year-old
elsewhere,
kid.
right? It could have been elsewhere in the Boston area. Anyway, Frank's a fascinating figure, important figure in the history of the Democratic Party, but also in the history of gay rights, right? Because one of the first out, like national figures. Well, I think the gay rights story is really important to this discussion, and here's why. It won't surprise you that because being gay and gay activity was illegal, gay publications were illegal too, and they were widely censored across this country. And the Supreme Court actually intervened in the 1950s and said that like some of these bodybuilding magazines that were popular among especially gay men were protected. You could do them, right? That was the trigger of the gay rights movement in this country.
Bodybuilding.
Right? Well, no, not bodybuilding in particular, but those
rulings
and the fact that, now it was legal for them to engage in this speech, right? I mean, just think about the way all that activity was tabooed, right? It's not surprising that those publications were hugely central in allowing people to connect in every sense, right? And so that's a really good example, it seems to me, right, of why speech is so important because, you take it away and then people who are stigmatized and people who are oppressed, right, they won't be able to connect. They won't be able to do the things that they need to do to change this world.
Yeah.
And that's the gay rights story. It's about their free speech.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is. And I don't think Barney was out then. but
yeah, probably not.
And he was compete. Now I remember the guy on the other end was a member of the Moral Majority.
Yeah.
Do you remember them?
Oh, of course.
Yeah, that guy was a representative.
Yeah.
I remember Barney Frank made fun of him for his American flag on his lapel.
Well, it was started by Jerry Falwell. Jerry Falwell Sr.
Was it really?
Yeah. Right after.
What year was that?
It was really, late 70s, early 80s. That was kind of the heyday. And they were influential in helping Reagan get elected.
Wow.
In 1980.
Well, that was the first time that religion was really used in a political sense, right? It was during the Reagan administration or the Reagan campaign.
Again, I wouldn't say the first time, but I would say that Reagan was very successful in weaponizing a certain sort of,
evangelical
conservative, right?
Yeah.
Let's remember, Jimmy Carter's an evangelical conservative, right? I'm sorry, he was an evangelical Christian, right? And very openly so, but obviously he interpreted that politically in a different way.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think kids and all of us would be way better off if there was open and free debate and if they didn't pull fire alarms when people that they don't agree with started talking. And it just seems so strange to me that that's controversial to say in 2021. It seems like there has been there's a missing chunk of progress with this adoption of safe spaces and trigger warnings and all this shit that everybody thinks is just a part of the program now.
And I would say actually I think the worst outcome is the one that we can't really measure, which is just kind of the sort of the spirit of self-censorship that attaches to all this. I mean, when you actually try to look at it and you see how many trigger warnings literally there haven't been that many. It's just that what you're creating is, again, a spirit of censorship.
Like what you were talking about before with people being afraid to talk about affirmative action.
Exactly. But, to the point of trigger warnings, I mean, when I taught at NYU, I taught a very big sweaty lecture class about the culture wars in American history, including many things we're talking about. And we did a unit about pornography and pornography censorship and regulation, all that. And as part of that unit, I showed a film actually by an NYU colleague called The Price of Pleasure, which is an anti-porn movie. And one of the ways it tries to make its argument is like by including some awful, violent, misogynist clips. And what I would do before I showed that movie is I would just describe in clinical detail what these clips were. And just to tell the students—
Where are the clips from? From what year?
They were from porn movies this would have been probably the early aughts, something like that. And all sorts of terrible stuff. And look, and I would say to the students—
Was that unusual back then, though, to have that kind of— like, when did that kind of porn become normal?
Well, I think after the internet revolution. I mean, I would say—
So somewhere in the late 90s.
Yeah, or maybe even later than that, because not everyone people didn't have as much access to the internet. I mean, anyway, to the point of triggers, I mean, I would tell the students what it was in, and I would say, like, I'm going to show the movie during these times. Like, if you don't want to see that, you don't have to come to that. Right? And for all practical purposes, that was a trigger warning. Right? And I think in some instances that's legitimate.
Yes.
The problem is, of course, is we get this concept creep where we now drag it over everything.
Right.
So people, I mean, there was an incident a few years ago where like kids demanded trigger warnings for bloody movie scenes in a course about horror movies.
Oh, boy.
And I'm like, look, dude, I'm not a bloody movie scene guy either. I get that part.
Yeah.
But what I don't get is selecting a course, an elective course,
on horror movies. If bloody movie scenes aren't your jam, that's so
that
silly.
I don't get.
God.
It is silly, and there have been all sorts of things like that. There have been people who have demanded trigger warnings for Downton Abbey.
Really?
Because there's bad shit that happens in Downton Abbey, right? There's like sexual coercion and there's suicide and there's like, I mean, there's like some ugly stuff.
Yeah, you don't get trigger warnings. Just no. But trigger warnings for those violent porn movies, that kind of makes sense. Like, because you're talking about something that's insanely disturbing.
Right.
And also, it's like, I wonder what happened there. Like, how did we go from, if you go to the ancient nudie films, it was all pretty straightforward, just men and women kissing and then eventually having sex, right? And then you go into the 1980s, kind of the same thing. Like, when did the whole violent thing happen? Like, when did that take place?
Well, I do think that there were so-called snuff films. There were violent movies.
There were snuff films, sure.
There were, absolutely were, including some very horrible things. I mean, I think, I think that, if we had a evolutionary psychologist here, they would just say, look, it's pretty simple. What happens is the internet creates a demand for variety, right? Because it presents an infinite number of possibilities. So in the pre-internet days, right, you can only produce so much material, and it probably has to appeal to a fairly wide spectrum, right? Once the internet kicks in, right, you can slice and dice everything to ever narrow more audiences.
I see what you're saying.
Right?
Yeah.
And so they're going to be,
Specialists.
they're going to be people with all sorts of, all kinds of fetishes and all kinds of awful things, and you can tailor your product to them.
Now, where does that fit in your opinion of free speech?
Well, look, I mean, I as an educator and as a parent, I'm troubled by the fact that lots of young men in this country are getting their sexual education from porn. I'm troubled by that, and I'm glad it didn't exist when I was a kid. I mean, to me, the interesting question isn't why 16-year-old boys watch porn. It's why they don't do it like 24/7. I mean, I think if it existed when I was a 16-year-old boy, I think I would have been very tempted to do that. And I think it would have fucked me up in a whole number of ways. But that's not a good argument for getting rid of it. That's an argument for trying to promote a different kind of sexual education, right? Porn is sex ed. It's just bad sex ed. It's a way of socializing people, especially young men, to a certain kind of understanding of what sex is or should be. And I think a lot of it is a very narrow and flawed understanding. But the answer to that is not, okay, let's get rid of all the porn, right? The answer to that is for our institutions, especially our educational institutions, to put forth a different model.
But what about when porn stretches off into violence? And then is that protected?
Well, look, I mean, some of it isn't, right? I mean, just by law, right? The stuff involving minors, for example, right?
Yes,
I mean,
but
that's against the law, and I think
right, yeah.
I think almost every reasonable person thinks that that's reasonable.
Yes.
Look, Joe, no freedom is truly absolute.
Right.
No freedom, including free speech, right? You can't call the White House and say that you're going to kill the president. Is
Too
that
late.
a quote? Is that a restriction on your speech? Well, of course it is.
Right.
And I think reasonable people think that's a reasonable restriction, right? I can't say to one of my students, I really like that sweater that you're wearing, and if you wear it again, I'll give you an A. Right? Is that a, quote, restriction on my speech? Of course it is. And by the way, one that I'm happy to abide by, right? There is no right of any kind that is absolute, right? I think the only interesting question is which are the kinds that actually should be restricted.
That's where the question lies. That's what I'm saying.
Right. And
different people have different ideas of what should and shouldn't be okay.
They will. And I guess my plea would be, let's have that discussion, right? Let's have a free speech discussion about free speech, right? That is free and unbridled, where the person who's making the plea for having all the porn be allowed isn't automatically vilified as a misogynist or a woman hater, although surely some of the consumers of that product are exactly that.
Yeah.
Let's actually have that discussion. So, I mean, in some ways, this goes back to Mary Beth Tinker because, when the court ruled that she could wear this armband, the court did not say you can say whatever the fuck you want in school at any time because that would be mayhem, right? You can't do it. What they said is if the school wants to restrict the speech, it has to show that there was a threat of material and substantial disruption to learning. And by the way, in that particular case, in a school district of 18,000, 7 kids wore armbands to school.
Wow.
And there was apparently Mary Beth has told me, during the oral argument at one point, Thurgood Marshall asked, okay, how many kids were wearing the armbands? They said 7. And Marshall said, and what exactly were you afraid of? Like what was going to be? And apparently then Marshall fell asleep, which in his later years he was known to do. And Mary Beth, who was actually at the hearing, said that's when they knew they had won.
That's hilarious.
So I mean, that's a good example, right?
Yeah.
Like you can't stand up in the middle of the class and say, Mr. Jones is the N-word or the F-word, right? You can't do that.
Right.
And we all understand that, right? But you can wear an armband. And the point is, if the school wants to restrict it, the onus has to be on the school. It has to be on the institution to show why this is necessary. Like the kid doesn't have to make that plea, right? The default position should be the kid is a citizen and, by the way, a future voter, right? And like the court said, like your rights don't disappear at the schoolhouse gate.
Yeah.
In fact, the school is where you're supposed to learn about those rights. Right? Now, this is not, by the way, a settled question. And you may have read that the Supreme Court just yesterday was hearing a case about this. It's in Mahoney, Pennsylvania, up near Joe Biden country, near Scranton. And this is one I think you would love, Joe. And I'm surprised you even haven't had the cheerleader on. This is the cheerleader case that's ringing a bell. Here's what it is very briefly. 15-year-old kid, she tries out for the cheerleading team. She's on the JV. She wants to get to varsity. And she finds out on a Saturday that she wasn't elevated to varsity. When she finds out, she's at a convenience store buying something. She's, I think, with her mom. She couldn't drive at the time. And she Instagrams to her group chat, maybe 200 kids, fuck school, fuck cheerleading, fuck everything. Okay? And remember, this is just to the kids in her chat.
Right.
But there's another kid on the chat whose mom is like an assistant cheerleading coach.
Right.
And she shows it to the mom and takes a screenshot of it. And the school, suspended her and said she could never be in cheerleading. And there were other disciplinary things, too. And this case has worked its way up to the Supreme Court, and it was heard just yesterday. And, the questions from the justices, I listened to some of them because you can do that now. They were exactly on this question. They were now, remind me again, how this 15-year-old saying fuck cheer, how is that going to disrupt what you do at school? Oh, and by the way, do you really want to be monitoring all the chats of all the kids?
Right.
I mean, that's and
So
that's
short-sighted and stupid.
And that's how they're going to learn what democracy is. You're going to be monitoring all their internet shit and saying if what they
You're a tyrant.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it'll be interesting to see how the court rules because, again, no right is absolute. And we can all imagine things that this kid could have done, even on her phone in the convenience store, that the school might reasonably sanction. Let's suppose she had shared answers to a test that she wasn't supposed to have access to, right? Mm-hmm. That would disrupt the pedagogical process, right?
Yes.
And it would be reasonable, right, for the school to say, no, you can't do that, even though you weren't on school property.
Right. She's just expressing herself to her friends.
And in fuck patois that every teenager uses, right? I mean, come on.
It's funny. If I was the parent, I'd be like, whoever that parent is that sent a screenshot, they should be forced to pay all the legal fees for all this.
I don't think that's going to happen. And actually, the school organizations, like the principals organizations and the superintendent's organization, and also the Biden's Department of Education, they rallied around the school. They submitted briefs to allow the school to do this. And their argument is, look, there's all this terrible bullying going on the net, which is true. There's sometimes awful racist shit. We've got to be able to sanction that. And I think the right response to that is, look, we have anti-harassment laws.
Right.
We already have those, right?
Yeah.
And you can use those carefully if you like. We can't give you a blank check.
Right.
That's not how America works or should work. We don't just walk around trying to regulate everybody's texts.
Especially kids.
Oh, come on.
I mean, they're just learning how to use these phones anyway. This is a whole new thing over the last couple decades of kids being able to do this.
Exactly.
There's no real boundaries and real clear set way of using it correctly, and especially in group chats. People love saying crazy shit in group chats. That's one of the funnest things. Right?
Yeah.
Listen, man, we just went through 3 hours, believe it or not.
My goodness.
And thank you. I really appreciate it. Your book is available now, right?
Yeah.
Free speech and why you should give a damn. Jonathan Zimmerman.
And co-authored with Signe Wilkinson, who is, by the way, the first woman in American history to win the Pulitzer Prize for cartooning.
Oh, all right. So there's cartoons in here.
Yes.
Yeah.
She,
look at that.
she is a giant.
Right.
A genius of the craft.
Well, listen,
Yeah.
I really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you very much.
It was really fun.
It was
Thank
fun.
you, Jeff.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Bye,
Take
everybody.
care.